Hey there, and welcome back. Take a deep breath and let the day fall away from you, because tonight's story is the whole arc of a life. If you have ever wanted to know a famous historical figure as the person they actually were, rather than as the headline that survived them, you are in the right place. If you have ever read a name in a history book and wished you could meet the human being behind it, if you have ever felt that the past most worth knowing is the past lived from the inside by people with mothers and sisters and ordinary mornings, then let me take you back nearly 150 years and walk you year by year through the entire life of a girl her own family called Sunny, a girl who would grow up to wear more diamonds than any other woman in Europe, marry into a country she was never permitted to belong to, and find herself, at the end, in a house at the edge of Siberia where her last room had striped wallpaper. Close your eyes and let your mind drift back to a midsummer morning in June of 1872 in a Rhineland town called Darmstadt, where the sixth child of a Hessian Grand Duke and an English princess is being born, and no one in that nursery yet knows that the baby in the cradle is going to become the last empress of Russia. Before we begin, let me know where you are listening from, and if you enjoy peaceful history stories like these, I'd really love for you to subscribe. This channel is growing because of people like you who return night after night to relax, unwind, and wander through the past with me. And if you leave a comment, just know that I read and reply to every single one I receive. I genuinely love hearing where you're listening from and meeting the people who spend these evenings here together. Now let me introduce you to the girl who was born in Darmstadt. That morning was, by accident of birth, related to almost every reigning house in Europe. Her grandmother was the Queen of England and Empress of India. Her aunt was the Empress of Germany. Her uncle would become King Edward VII. One of her sisters would marry a Russian Grand Duke. Another would marry a Battenberg, and through that marriage become the great-grandmother of the British king alive today. Her brother-in-law would become King of Greece. Her cousins would sit on the thrones of Spain, Romania, Norway, Denmark, and beyond. The Russia she eventually married into would reshape the 20th century when it fell. The Britain her grandmother ruled would, in different forms, shape the constitutional life of more than 50 countries that still exist now. Which means that wherever you are listening from tonight, a village in the English Midlands, or a suburb of Auckland, a coastal town in British Columbia, or a flat in Berlin, a farmhouse in the American Midwest, somewhere on the line between Kyiv and the Black Sea, a town in India whose name once appeared on her grandmother's list of titles, there is, almost without exception, a thread of this woman's family that ran through the place you are sitting in. The world she was born into was the Europe of monarchies, a continent in which every border, every alliance, every war, and every peace was negotiated through families that had married each other for 10 centuries. Darmstadt was the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse, and by Rhine a Lutheran principality of perhaps 500,000 people, ruled with affection rather than splendour by a household that loved music and gardens and large family teas. Her father, Prince Louis, would later become Grand Duke Ludwig IV. He was a kindly cavalry officer of limited political consequence and considerable personal decency. Her mother, Princess Alice, was the second daughter of Queen Victoria, a thoughtful, melancholic Englishwoman who had married into Germany at 19 and who carried the habits of Osborne and Windsor into a foreign court. The new baby was christened Victoria Alex Helena Louise Beatrice. She would be called Alex at home for the first 22 years of her life. Tonight you are going to live every one of those years and the 24 that followed them. The people who would move through this life are not strangers to history. Her grandmother Victoria, the Queen Empress, would become a second mother to her after her own mother died in 1878. Her sisters, Victoria, Ella, Irene, May, would each take a different turn through Europe's courts, one as a Battenberg princess in England, one as a Russian Grand Duchess, one as a Prussian princess in Berlin, one as a child whose name remained on her sister's lips for the rest of her life. Her brother Ernie would inherit the duchy and write to her until the end. The man she would marry, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, would prove the most devoted, the most thoughtful, and the most catastrophically unsuited monarch of his century. Their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, would become the most photographed children of their age, and then the most mourned. And one figure who was neither royal nor noble nor educated, a wandering peasant from a village in western Siberia, would walk into her life when her son was 4 years old and change everything that came after. You will meet all of them tonight, in the order she did. So settle in. The afternoon light is coming through the casement of a Darmstadt nursery. A young Englishwoman is upstairs, exhausted, holding a newborn. Outside, the Rhine plain spreads east toward the river, the orchards in their June green, the town bells striking the hour. The baby in the cradle is healthy. Her mother is happy. The world has not yet asked anything of either of them. This is where her life begins, on a midsummer morning, in a place where nothing has happened yet. The Grand Duchy of Hesse and by Rhine had been part of the new German Empire only since the year before Alex was born. It was a duchy in the older European sense, a court of perhaps 200 people in a town of 50,000, run from a palace at one end of the Marktplatz, with country residences at Wolfsgarten and Kranichstein and Heiligenberg for the warmer months. The reigning house was an ancient Lutheran line going back to the Reformation, and the rooms it inhabited were neither vast nor poor. They were the rooms of an old comfortable family that had run the same town for several centuries. Children were born in those rooms, grew up in them, married in them, were prayed for in them when they were ill, and were buried under flat memorial slabs in the chapel down the road. There was nothing remarkable about the household into which Alex arrived, except that her mother was the daughter of the Queen of England, and her grandmother, 3 days' travel away in a country house on the Isle of Wight, was the most powerful woman alive. Princess Alice was 30 when her 6th child was born. She had married Prince Louis of Hesse in 1862, 2 years after losing her father, the Prince Consort, and 1 year after her elder sister Vicky had married the future German Emperor. The wedding at Osborne had been a sombre affair. Queen Victoria, still in mourning for her husband, had insisted on a private ceremony in the dining room rather than a state occasion. Alice had then settled into Darmstadt with the practical seriousness that marked everything she did. She had inherited her father's earnest intelligence and her mother's stubborn affection. She read German philosophy. She corresponded with Florence Nightingale about hospital reform. She had founded the Alice Society for the training of nurses during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, when wounded men had filled every spare bed in the duchy. She believed, with the modesty of her father's example, that a princess existed to be useful to her people, and she had set about being useful with characteristic thoroughness. By the time Alex was born, Alice had buried 1 child already. Her 3rd son, Friedrich, called Fritti, had died the year before, in the spring of 1873, after a fall from a window at the new palace. He had been bleeding internally before the fall, and the bleeding could not be stopped afterwards. He was 2.5 years old. The condition that had killed him was not understood at the time, but it was the same condition Alice herself had carried in her blood without knowing it, the silent inheritance from her mother that ran through Victoria's daughters and granddaughters, and would, years later, surface again in a place Alice could not have imagined. For now, in Darmstadt, in 1872 and 1873, Fritti was a name spoken in a hushed register at family meals, a small grave in the family chapel, a portrait in the nursery hall. Alex grew up in his absence. She was too young to have known him, but she knew the shape of him in her mother's face. The household into which she was born settled into a rhythm. The nursery was on the upper floor of the new palace, with windows that looked out over the Wilhelminenplatz. The younger children, Ernie, who was 4, Alex, the baby, and May, who would arrive 2 years later, were under the care of an English nurse called Mrs. Orchard, whose habits had been formed at Osborne, and who ran her nursery on the same lines. Mrs. Orchard rose at 6. The children were dressed in plain linen frocks and brought down to their mother's sitting room for an hour after breakfast, where Alice spoke to them in English and read them stories from the same picture books she had read as a child in Buckingham Palace. The older sisters, Victoria, the eldest, who was 9 when Alex was born, Ella, 2 years younger, Irene, the third, wore older versions of the same plain dresses and sat at small tables doing their lessons. The boys were treated less plainly. Ernie was being prepared in the manner of all small Hessian princes for the duchy he would one day inherit, and his upbringing carried that weight from the cradle. The household was deliberately modest. Alice had decided, in conscious imitation of her father, that her children would not be raised in the manner of royal children elsewhere in Europe. They would have no flattery and no spoiling. They would do their own mending, where possible. They would visit the cottages of the poor in Darmstadt with their mother on Saturday afternoons. They would learn German, French, and English. They would learn the Bible, in both Lutheran and Anglican translations. They would learn music, in which Alice herself was accomplished, and they would learn the names of the wildflowers at Wolfsgarten. They were not encouraged to think themselves remarkable. The point of being a princess, in Alice's understanding, was to be a useful instrument of one's country, and the point of being useful was to forget that one was a princess at all. It was a hard standard, and her daughters absorbed it differently. Victoria absorbed it as competence. Ella absorbed it as beauty turned outward. Irene absorbed it as duty. Alex would absorb it, in time, as something closer to religious vocation. She was a happy child in the early years. The family nickname Sunny had attached itself to her almost from the beginning, given by her mother in letters home to Windsor. Our Sunny, the sunniest of the lot, the one who comes down in the morning with her hair like a halo and laughs at nothing. The early photographs show a fair-haired girl with the sort of fine features that became delicate later, but were rounded and open then, dressed in the white smocks her mother preferred, with one of her sister's hands always nearby. She loved her father with the uncomplicated love a small daughter has for a kind man. She adored her mother in the deeper and more fragile way she would later love only 1 or 2 people in her life. She followed Ernie everywhere. She was indulged by Ella, who was the beauty of the household, and who took her littler sisters seriously in the way an 8-year-old can. She was, in those years before everything happened, exactly the child her mother had hoped to raise affectionate, observant, modest, devoted, gentle of temper, slow to take offence. The household's year had a shape. Winters were spent at the new palace in Darmstadt, where the rooms were heated by porcelain stoves and where the children walked in pairs around the snowy Marktplatz with their nurse. Spring brought the move to Wolfsgarten, the family's country residence, a hunting lodge of the old style set in deep beech forests 15 miles east of the city. Summer was Heiligenberg, the home of Alice's brother-in-law Prince Alexander of Hesse, where a tribe of cousins of the Battenberg line ran wild in the gardens above the Rhine. Autumn often included a stay in England at Osborne if Queen Victoria was in residence there, at Balmoral if she was in Scotland, and these English visits formed the deepest channels of Alex's childhood imagination, the smell of the heather on the Aberdeenshire hills, the taste of the strong dark tea her grandmother drank at 5 in the afternoon, the rooms at Osborne with their views over the Solent, the Indian Kansamars and Highland gillies who came in and out of her grandmother's day. These were the textures she would carry to St. Petersburg, and that would, decades later, soften her exile in places where nothing was English at all. And there were brothers and sisters everywhere. She was the 6th child, but her sisters had begun to feel almost like a separate generation by the time she was old enough to notice them. Victoria, the eldest, was already a serious young woman of 12 when Alex was 3. She would go on to marry Prince Louis of Battenberg in 1884, and through that marriage to become, generations later, the great-grandmother of the British King, alive at the time of this story's telling. Elia, the second sister, was a beauty by the age of 10, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, with the kind of composure that made strangers in the street turn to look at her. Irene, the third, was the quiet one, less remarked upon, devoted to her mother. Ernie was Alex's particular companion. They shared a nursery, they shared a nurse, they shared a private language built from misheard adult phrases and made-up names for the furniture. And in the spring of 1874, when Alex was not yet 2, her youngest sister was born Marie, called May, who would become the playmate of her childhood, and whose absence would be the first great absence of her life. May was a different sort of child from her elder sister. Where Alex was reserved, May was a small whirlwind, dark-haired in a family of fair-haired girls, loud where the others were quiet, openly affectionate where Alex had begun, even at 4 and 5, to need privacy in her affections. They were inseparable. Mrs. Orchard's letters to Alice during the family's summer absences described them as one creature with 2 heads, sleeping in the same bed when neither of them was supposed to, sharing whichever toy was the favourite that week, walking hand in hand around the gravel paths at Wolfsgarten while their elder siblings played croquet on the lawn. Alex's earliest surviving memories, dictated later in life to a lady-in-waiting, were almost all of May, of a doll's tea table in the nursery at the new palace, of being lifted up to look out a high window at a passing regiment, of May laughing because Alex had said the wrong word for something and could not be persuaded that any other word was right. It was an ordinary, sheltered, deeply loved childhood. Princess Alice's letters to her mother, preserved in volumes that run to thousands of pages, record it with the unmistakable warmth of a mother who knows she is fortunate. The Hessian court was not an exciting place. The little duchy was not a country of consequence. The children were not particularly clever or particularly remarkable. They were healthy, with the exception of the lost Fritty. They were loved. They were learning their letters in 3 languages and their manners in 2 cultures. They would, in the ordinary expectation of European royal children of that decade, grow up to marry their cousins and inherit other small duchies and live somewhere between Britain and Russia, somewhere on the long thread of family that linked the courts of Europe to each other, somewhere unremarkable and useful and good. Nothing in Princess Alice's letters from those years suggests that any other future was even imaginable. And then, in the late autumn of 1878, an illness moved into the house. It came in unannounced, as illnesses do. Victoria, the eldest daughter, was the first to fall ill. She had complained of a sore throat through the early days of November, and by the middle of the month she was bedridden with high fever and the white deposits on the throat that the doctors knew to recognize. Diphtheria was, in 1878, one of the great killers of European childhood. There was no vaccine, no antitoxin, no antibiotic. There was only nursing and the will of the body to survive. The disease passed easily from one person to another, especially in a family living closely together in shared rooms, and once it entered a household it tended to take its course through every member who had not yet had it. The doctors at the new palace immediately separated Victoria from the younger children. They posted a nurse at her door. They burned the bed linen. They tried to do everything that was known to be done. It was not enough. Within a week, Alice and her remaining children began to fall ill one after another. Alex, who had turned 6 in June, came down with the fever first, and then May, and then Irene, and then Ernie, and then their father. Only Ella was spared. She had been sent away to relatives at the first sign of illness in the house, and would remain in quarantine for weeks, learning by telegram what was happening at home. Alice nursed the others herself. She had been trained in nursing through her work with the Alice Society. She would not allow anyone else to take the worst of it. She moved between the bedrooms night and day, washing faces, holding hands, reading aloud from the books her children loved. Her own letters to her mother during those weeks describe the exhaustion and the fear in language that is almost unbearable to read now, sentences broken off mid-thought, scrawled in the margins of paper that had clearly been carried from one sick room to the next. May was the smallest. She was 4 years old, and her body had less to fight with than the others. On the night of November the 15th, she was very ill, and on the morning of November the 16th, Princess Alice took her into her own bed because the child would not stop crying. The doctors had given up on her by then, though they had not yet said so. Alice held her through the morning. The little girl died in her arms some time before noon, in a room 2 floors above the Wilhelminenplatz, with the November sky over Darmstadt the colour of pewter. Alice did not tell the other children that their sister was gone. They were still very ill, and the news, the doctors believed, might be more than any of their fevered bodies could bear. For 2 weeks Alice carried the secret. She continued to nurse the others, smiling at each bedside, telling each child that May was sleeping in another room and could not yet come to play. She wrote a letter to her mother on the evening of May's death, one of the most devastating letters in the royal archives, and then she put on her ordinary nurse's apron and went back to work. The other children rallied. Victoria began to recover. Irene's fever broke. Ernie's throat cleared. Alex, who had been the worst affected after May, opened her eyes one morning at the beginning of December and asked when she could go and find May, who had been so long away from her now. Alice sat on the edge of her bed and told her. It was the first death of Alex's life that she had been old enough to know about, and it was the death of the sister she had been inseparable from since the day May was born. She wept silently. She did not eat. She did not speak for nearly a week. In the official histories, the diphtheria visitation of November and December 1878 is given a paragraph. The reality for the children who survived it was that the household never recovered. The nursery at the new palace was emptied. Mrs. Orchard, on the orders of the doctors, burned every toy that May and Alex had shared. Every doll, every stuffed creature, every wooden animal. The principle was hygienic. The effect on a 6-year-old child who had lost her sister was something else again. Alex, when she was very old, told a lady-in-waiting that the burning of the toys was the thing she remembered with the most precise pain from her childhood. Not the death itself, the death she had not seen, but the absence of the toys, the empty shelves, the smell of the smoke, the feeling that not only May but every object that May had ever touched had been taken away by adults who thought they were being kind. And then, 2 weeks after May's death, the illness came back for Alice. She had kissed her son Ernie on the forehead a few days earlier. Ernie was recovering and was grieving for May, and Alice could not stop herself. The doctors had warned her. She had ignored the warning. The diphtheria entered her own throat within days. She did not have the strength of a child fighting for the first time. She had the exhaustion of a mother who had been carrying the household on her shoulders for a month. She fell ill on the 8th of December. She was very ill by the 10th. She lost consciousness on the 13th, and on the morning of the 14th of December 1878, the anniversary to the day of her father the Prince Consort's death 17 years earlier, Princess Alice of Hesse, second daughter of Queen Victoria, died in her bed at the new palace. She was 35 years old. Her last word, the nurses said, was for May. Her surviving children were ranged through the upstairs rooms in various stages of recovery. The eldest, Victoria, was 15, Alex was 6, Ernie was 10. Their father, Prince Louis, was sitting in the next room when the doctor came out and told him. Queen Victoria received the telegram at Windsor in the early afternoon. She had loved Alice with the deepest of her maternal loves. Alice had been the daughter who held her in the days after her husband's death. Alice had been the daughter she had not always treated kindly, but had always relied upon. She wrote in her journal that evening that the news was the worst she had received since the death of the Prince Consort himself. She made arrangements at once. The Hessian children were to be brought to England as soon as they were strong enough to travel. Their father was to be supported in every possible way. She, the grandmother, would assume the role their mother could no longer fill. From the morning of the 14th of December 1878 until her own death in 1901, Queen Victoria considered the Hessian grandchildren to be her own particular charges, and Alex, the small fair-haired girl who had been Alice's sonny, the one who looked the most like her mother, became from that day forward Queen Victoria's most carefully watched grandchild on the European continent. Alex did not understand all of it at the time. She understood that her mother had gone where May had gone. She understood that the rooms at the new palace were quieter now, that her father wept in the mornings, that the elder sisters were trying to be brave for the younger ones, that Mrs. Orchard's voice trembled when she read aloud at night. She understood that her grandmother in England, whom she had visited each year, and whom she had loved as a kind of legendary figure on the far side of the Channel, was now writing letters every week, and sending instructions and asking after each of them by name. She did not understand, because at 6 years old she could not yet have understood, that her childhood had ended. The end had come over 6 weeks in the late autumn of 1878. She was a different child afterwards. The brightness her mother had named her for did not entirely return. Her surviving siblings noticed it first. Victoria, the eldest, wrote to her cousins that Alex had become strangely silent, that she clung to particular objects with the seriousness of a much older child, that she preferred the corner of the schoolroom to the open part of the garden, that she would sit for an hour at a time without speaking and then suddenly burst into tears at something no one had said. Mrs. Orchard reported the same thing in less elegant language. The child wanted holding more often and could not always be held when she wanted it. The doctors thought it would pass. It did not entirely pass. The Alex who emerged from the winter of 1878, 6 years old, half English and half German, the surviving smaller sister in a family that had lost a sister and a mother in 3 weeks, would carry the shape of that loss with her for the rest of her life, and it would manifest in her adolescence and her marriage and her motherhood and her exile in ways she herself would not always be able to name. Queen Victoria came over to Germany for the funerals. She had not crossed the Channel since her widowhood and had no taste for German court ceremony, but she came. She stood beside her son-in-law in the Lutheran chapel at Rosenhohe, the cemetery on the hill above Darmstadt where Alice and May were buried side by side beneath simple slabs. She held each of her grandchildren in turn. She held Alex the longest, sitting in a corner of the New Palace nursery with the child on her lap and her own black-gloved hand stroking the fair hair. She told her grandchildren, in the voice she had used with her own children when their father died, that they were not alone, that they would never be alone, that England was always there for them, and that their mother had loved them more than anything in the world. And then she went back to England, and within weeks she had written to Prince Louis of Hesse, formally asking that the children spend long periods of every year with her in the future, so that she might supervise their growth herself. Louis, devastated and grateful, agreed without hesitation. From the spring of 1879 onward, the Hessian grandchildren, and particularly Alex, became fixtures of the English royal calendar. The decade that followed was the decade Alex grew up in. Half of it she spent at Darmstadt, at Wolfsgarten, at Heiligenberg, in the house her mother had loved and the country her father ruled. The other half she spent at Osborne, at Balmoral, at Windsor, in the houses of her grandmother and the company of her English cousins. She was educated bilingually, sometimes trilingually. She had a German governess, an English governess, and a French tutor brought in for sessions of conversation. She read the books her grandmother thought important: Tennyson, Walter Scott, the Brontes, the Wesley hymns, the Bible in the King James translation, the German Lutheran Catechism in parallel. She learned to play the piano well enough that she could accompany her grandmother's evening hymn singing without rehearsal. She learned to ride. She learned to draw. She learned to embroider in the English style and to do plain sewing in the manner her mother had taught the older sisters. She learned to make conversation in 2 languages with elderly relatives who treated her with the careful tenderness reserved for orphaned grandchildren of consequence. And she learned, more than any other single thing, to be reserved. This was the development that surprised those who had known her as a child. The Alex who had been her mother's sonny became, by her 10th year and her 12th and her 15th, a girl whose surface composure cost her something to maintain. She did not laugh easily in company. She blushed deeply when addressed by strangers. She was thought, by the courtiers at Darmstadt and the household at Windsor, to be shy almost to the point of awkwardness, a fair-haired, blue-eyed, increasingly beautiful young girl who was unable to enter a room of more than 10 people without colour, rising in her cheeks and her hands knotting themselves in front of her dress. The shyness was real. It was not, however, the whole of her temperament. Inside, those who knew her well reported, she was passionate, decided, and capable of feeling things with an intensity her composure entirely concealed. She loved fiercely. She had opinions she did not share. She was, even at 12, deeply religious in a private, unfashionable, Anglican-Lutheran fusion of habit and conviction. She was not the bright outward child her mother had named. She was a careful interior child with a self she protected. Queen Victoria saw it all. The Queen had watched her own daughters grow up. She had a practiced eye for the temperament of a granddaughter. She wrote to Vicky in Berlin, and to other relations in private correspondence, that Alex was developing into the most reserved of the Hessian sisters, that she was clever but withdrawn, that she would be a beauty if she ever learned to wear her own face in public, that she reminded the Queen unbearably of Alice in some respects, and unsettlingly of nothing of Alice at all in others. The Queen made up her mind, somewhere in the middle of the 1880s, that this particular granddaughter would need to marry well, and would need to marry into a household that understood her difficulty in public situations. The Queen had a candidate in mind. The Queen, in fact, had several candidates in mind, all of them suitable English or German princes who would have given Alex a life of large country houses and small public ceremonies, with kindly courts and predictable seasons. The Queen would in time work hard to bring those marriages about. The Queen would also in time fail entirely. What Alex did not know yet, what no one in any of the great houses she was passing through could yet have known, was that another household, half a continent away, in a country none of her German cousins had ever visited, and none of her English ones would ever fully understand, was watching her too. She had been to Russia once, in the summer she was 12, for her sister Ella's wedding. She had walked through the gardens at Peterhof. She had stood in the Winter Palace's Hall of Mirrors. She had been introduced briefly to a thin, nervous boy of 16 with grey-blue eyes and an old-fashioned formality of manner who had been told, in a household where everyone watched the heir apparent with anxious affection, that the small German cousin in the white dress was someone he ought to remember. He had remembered, in fact, with a precision and a steadiness that would surprise everyone in his own family. By the time Alex was 16, a young man in St. Petersburg was writing her name in his diary regularly, and by the time she was 20, he had decided that he would not marry anyone else in the world. But that summer, the summer of Ella's wedding in 1884, was several years in the future. For now, in the early 1880s, Alex was a girl moving between Germany and England, the youngest surviving daughter of a house that had been visited by loss, a granddaughter being raised with care by the oldest grandmother on the continent. Her days had the rhythms of the era: lessons in the morning, walks in the afternoon, tea at 5, hymns at 7, bed at 9. She had her sister's company in the summers and her grandmother's company in the autumns. She had her father's tender absent attention through it all. She was being shaped by the long repeated rituals of two of Europe's most stable households, neither of which had any idea that they were preparing her, all unknowingly, for a third household that would tear up every habit she had ever learned and ask of her something neither England nor Hesse had ever required of any woman. The visits to Osborne were the parts of those years that Alex loved most. Osborne House, Prince Albert's Italianate villa on the Isle of Wight, with its terraces stepping down toward the Solent, had been her mother's favourite house, and it became Alex's by inheritance. She knew every gravel path. She knew which trees her uncles had climbed as boys. She knew the swimming hut at the bottom of the cliff where the royal children had been taught to bathe in cold seawater under their grandmother's strict instructions. She knew the Durbar room, with its Indian plasterwork, where her grandmother held court when distinguished visitors came down from London. She knew the little museum at the side of the house, full of trophies sent home from the corners of an empire her grandmother had never visited. And she knew by heart the long rows of family photographs ranged along the corridors, including the photographs of her mother as a girl, in the same dresses Alex herself was now growing into. The continuity of the house was a kind of consolation. Her mother had lived in these rooms. Her mother had walked these paths. Her mother had stood at this window. She, Alex, was now standing there too, and the standing felt, on the better days, like a way of staying close to a parent she could not otherwise reach. Balmoral was different. Balmoral was wilder, colder, more emphatically Scottish, and somehow more emphatically the Queen's. The household there ran on Highland rules that Queen Victoria had imposed in the 1850s and never relaxed. Long walks in all weathers, picnics on the heather even when it was raining, gillies in attendance for every excursion, evening reels danced by the visiting royal cousins in tartan sashes, prayers led by the Queen herself before bed. Alex learned to love it. She would write in later life that Balmoral had been one of the places where she had felt the safest in her childhood, because at Balmoral nothing was expected of her except that she should walk in the heather, sit at her grandmother's right hand at supper, sing the evening hymns in tune, and be present. Presence was the whole of the demand. She could be presence without performance, and the relief of that, for a child of her temperament, was profound. And Windsor was the great house in which she came to understand her own family in its widest sense. Windsor, in the 1880s, was the centre of the largest royal household in Europe. Every state visit, every dynastic engagement, every diplomatic conference of any importance ran through its corridors. Alex met her cousins there. She met her cousin Vicky's son, the young Wilhelm already by his 15th year, the awkward and self-conscious boy who would become Kaiser Wilhelm II, and who developed an embarrassing infatuation for her that he never entirely shook off. She met her English cousins at Sandringham, her Uncle Bertie's children, including the dim affectionate Eddie, who was briefly considered for her hand, and his younger brother George, who would one day become King George V. She met the Russian relations who came through on state visits, the dim figures of her sister Ella's new in-laws, with their thick black beards and their imperial manners. The whole of the European royal family ran through Windsor in those years, and Alex watched it all with the silent observation of a girl who knew she was being watched in turn. By the time she was 16, in 1888, she had grown into her beauty. She was tall for a young woman of the era, slender, with the heavy auburn hair that had become reddish gold by adolescence, and that she wore in a heavy knot at the back of her neck. Her features were her mother's fine, evenly placed, with a high forehead and the long Hessian nose, and her eyes, which were blue-grey and unusually large, were the feature visitors remarked upon most often. She had her father's height. She had her grandmother's bearing. She had her mother's seriousness. She was, by general agreement among her relations, the most beautiful of Princess Alice's surviving daughters, although she did not believe it, and was uncomfortable when she heard it said. Photographs from her confirmation that spring show her in white, her hair down for the last time before adult hairstyles took over, her eyes fixed on a point off to the right of the camera, as if she were waiting for someone to release her from the obligation of being photographed at all. She was confirmed in the Lutheran faith that spring, in the chapel at the new palace, in front of her father and her sisters and her brother, and a small congregation of Hessian relations. The confirmation mattered to her. She had taken it seriously through the months of preparation. She had memorized the catechism in 3 languages. She had learned the hymns and could play many of them on the piano without sheet music. She had developed by 16 a faith of her own, Lutheran in its origins, Anglican in its habits, marked by the long evening prayers at Osborne and the morning hymns at Balmoral, and the deep family memory of her mother kneeling beside her bedside before sleep. She believed, with the seriousness of an only surviving younger daughter who had buried both her mother and her sister at 6, that the world ran on the will of God, and that to be a good person was to be a person willing to submit to that will. She would, within 5 years, be asked to revise the form of that belief in the most fundamental way she could have been asked to revise it. And she would refuse again and again before she finally surrendered. But for now, in the spring of 1888, she was a Lutheran girl of 16 in a Hessian palace, confirmed into the faith her mother had raised her in, watched over by a grandmother in England, mourned over still by a father who had never quite recovered from the December of 1878, beloved by her brother and her surviving sisters, beginning to draw the attention of the European marriage market in the way every well-born daughter of her age was beginning to do. She had been to Russia once, 4 years earlier. She had been noticed there by a young man whose name she barely remembered. She had returned to Darmstadt and to England and resumed the rhythms of her childhood. The Russian invitation, she had thought at the time, was the kind of single foreign episode every European princess accumulated and then largely forgot. She had no idea, as she sat for her confirmation portrait that spring, that the young man in St. Petersburg had not forgotten anything about her at all. The first Russian visit had been 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1884, when Alex was 12 and her sister Ella was 19. Ella was marrying Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, the 5th son of the late Tsar Alexander II of Russia and the younger brother of the reigning Tsar, Alexander III. The match had been considered surprising in Darmstadt. Sergei was a tall, severe, deeply religious man 12 years older than Ella, whose grim public manner concealed a private kindness that Ella had recognized during a long courtship, and that the rest of his family had recognized for years. Queen Victoria had disapproved. She had written to her daughter Vicky in Berlin that no granddaughter of hers should be sent to a country where political assassination was a routine event, and where the imperial family lived behind triple gates of armed soldiers. The previous Tsar, after all, had been murdered in his own carriage on a St. Petersburg street 3 years before. The bombs were still being found in the suburbs. The Queen wrote to Ella herself twice, asking her to reconsider. Ella, who had inherited the practical conviction of her mother along with all of her beauty, had written back politely that she had made up her mind. The wedding was set for early June 1884 at the Winter Palace. The whole Hessian family travelled to St. Petersburg for the marriage. Prince Louis took his 5 surviving children, Victoria, Irene, Ernie, Alex, and Ella herself, the bride. They went by train across Germany and into the Russian Empire. They were met at the frontier by an imperial train sent down to collect them. They reached St. Petersburg in a fanfare of military escorts and crowd-lined avenues that even Queen Victoria's England did not match for sheer noise of state pageantry. The Hessian children were exhausted, sun-darkened from the journey, awkward in their travelling clothes. They were handed out of the train into a reception at the Anikov Palace, where the Tsar's family was waiting to greet them. Alex, who was 12, was placed near the centre of the line beside her brother Ernie. She was wearing a white dress with a blue sash and white silk stockings. Her hair was down her back in a single thick plait. She was so frightened of the Russian uncles and aunts that she could not raise her eyes from the carpet. A thin, fair-haired boy of 16 stood at the far end of the line of cousins. He was wearing the white uniform of a junior officer of the household troops. He had been told to pay particular attention to the German cousin in the white dress. His name was Nicholas Alexandrovich, called Nicky by his family and Nicholas in the lists of European succession. He was the heir apparent to the throne of all the Russias, the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III and Tsarina Maria Feodorovna, who herself had been born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, and who was the sister of Princess Alexandra of Wales, Alex's English aunt by marriage. The relations were not particularly close in blood. Nicholas and Alix shared no common ancestor closer than the 18th century, but they were close enough in family habit that Nicholas had been raised to recognize her name and her parentage. He had not, however, expected to recognize her face. The thin, grave girl with the auburn plait struck him, as he later recorded, as more remarkable in person than he had been led to expect from her photograph. He was at the age 16 years and 3 months, at which boys begin to notice these things. He noticed. They met 3 times over the days that followed. They were placed near each other at a state dinner. They walked together with a chaperone in the gardens at Peterhof. They sat next to each other at the wedding of Ella and Sergei, which was held at the Winter Palace on the 3rd of June, and which Alex would remember in fragments for the rest of her life. The cathedral lit by 10,000 candles, the chanting of the Orthodox priests in vestments stiff with gold thread, the bride and groom standing under their crowns held by attendants, the kissing of the icons, the long procession from the chapel to the supper room. After supper there was dancing. Alex did not dance. She sat against the wall with her hand on her brother Ernie's arm. Nicholas, on the orders of his governess, and probably of his mother, asked her if she would like to walk through the long gallery to look at the portraits. She agreed. They walked. He showed her the portrait of his great-grandfather Nicholas I and the portrait of his grandfather Alexander II, who had emancipated the serfs and been murdered for it. He spoke quietly. She was less frightened of him than of the others. At some point on that long evening of the wedding, or perhaps on one of the days following it, the two of them found themselves at the window of one of the small drawing rooms at the Peterhof Palace, with a diamond ring of Ella's lying on the sill that had been left there during dressing. Nicholas took the ring. He scratched their 2 names on the glass, Nicky, and below it, Alex in the small wandering script of a 16-year-old. It was a piece of pure adolescent foolishness. It was the kind of thing a boy did when he was hoping a girl would understand what he was not yet bold enough to say. The window was discovered later by a footman. The names were left there, and as far as is known they were still there decades later, when the palace was finally requisitioned for other purposes. Alex did not see Nicholas scratching the names at first. She was looking at the garden. When she saw them, she went red, and she did not say anything, but she also did not say that he should rub them out. They were the first writing of their names together. They were not the last. The Hessian family stayed in Russia for a fortnight after the wedding. Nicholas attached himself to Alex in the way a 16-year-old in a household full of older relatives attaches himself to the one person of his own age that he is interested in. they walked. They sat. They were photographed together with the assembled cousins. They exchanged on the last evening before the Hessian party left a small token, a brooch from her, a ring from him, which they were not supposed to do, and which everyone in both households pretended not to have noticed. And then she went home to Darmstadt, and he went back to his lessons at the Anikov Palace, and they did not see each other again for 5 years. But neither of them forgot. He wrote her name in his diary perhaps 8 or 10 times during the months that followed. She kept the ring he had given her in a small jewel box in her dressing room at Wolfsgarten, and she kept it there until she was a married woman, and then she put it on a different ribbon. The years between the Russian visit and Alex's confirmation in 1888 were the years in which she grew up. The 4 years between 12 and 16 are formative years in any life. In hers, they were the years in which the reserve became permanent, the years in which her habit of religious feeling deepened from the conventional piety of her mother's instruction into a private conviction that she did not share even with her sisters, the years in which the heavy auburn hair came in and she stopped looking like the smaller cousin and began to look like the woman she would become. Photographs from the months around her confirmation show a young woman who could already, if she had wished, have been one of the beauties of any court in Europe. She did not wish. She wore plain dresses. She kept her eyes lowered in public. She found excuses not to attend balls when balls were proposed. She preferred the company of her grandmother in England and her father in Germany to almost any other society. She had, by 16, made the inward decision that she would marry only a man she loved, and that she would not be persuaded into a dynastic match by the customary arguments. She had not yet said this aloud to anyone. Queen Victoria, watching her closely, had begun to suspect it. The Queen had a candidate. Her name for him was Eddie Prince Albert Victor, eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the heir apparent after his father to the British throne. Eddie was a kindly, dim, listless young man in his early 20s. He had no particular intellectual interest in anything, including the kingdom he stood to inherit, but he had a sweetness of temper that his grandmother found endearing, and that she believed would suit Alex's reserved nature very well. The match would have made her, in the fullness of time, Queen of England. It would have brought her to the throne her mother had been raised at the foot of. It would have placed her at the centre of the European royal family, of which she was already an undisputed member. Queen Victoria proposed it formally to Alex in the spring of 1889, in a long letter sent down to Wolfsgarten in her own hand. Alex wrote back within a week. She had thought about it. She loved her cousin Eddie as a cousin. She would not marry him. She begged her grandmother to understand that her feelings on the matter were settled, that no pressure would alter them, that she had nothing against the young man but could not in conscience give her hand where her heart was not. The reply was the first refusal of her adult life. There would be more. The first of the more came in the autumn of the same year, 1889. The reigning Tsar of Russia, Alexander III, with his Danish wife Maria Feodorovna, made a state visit to Berlin and were entertained by Wilhelm II, who was Kaiser by then, and who was Alex's first cousin. The Tsar travelled with his eldest son, Nicholas, who was now 21, and who had been waiting 5 years to see Alex again. Nicholas extended an informal invitation, via his mother, for the Hessian princess to visit the Russian imperial family at Peterhof in the late summer. The Queen was opposed. She had not wanted Ella in Russia, and she did not want Alex anywhere near it. She wrote in her journal that the Russian court was no place for one of her granddaughters, that the political conditions were dangerous, that the religious questions were impossible, that the climate was harsh and the manners alien. But Alex's father Louis had no such reservations. He had liked the Russian family in 1884. He could see no harm in his daughter visiting her elder sister, who was now established at the Belozersky Palace in St. Petersburg as the wife of Grand Duke Sergei. He gave permission for the visit, and in late August Alex arrived in Russia for a stay that was to last 6 weeks. She was 17. Nicholas was 21. The 5 years had altered both of them. She had become the beauty her relations had predicted she would. He had become a slim, fair-bearded young man with melancholy grey-blue eyes and the unmistakable manner of a Tsarevich who had been raised to know that he would one day rule a sixth of the earth's surface, but who was in his private life almost painfully ordinary. He took her riding. He took her to the ballet. He took her to Tsarskoye Selo and showed her the Catherine Palace where he had spent his boyhood. He took her to suppers with his sisters and brothers and made conversation about the gardens at Wolfsgarten because he had read about them in a letter she had once written to Ella. He was, by the end of the 2nd week of her visit, openly in love with her. By the end of the 4th, he had told his mother that he intended to ask her to marry him. By the end of the 5th, he had asked his father's permission. By the end of the 6th, with Alex sitting in the long drawing room at Peterhof on a September afternoon, he asked her. She refused him. She refused him gently and without drama, but she refused him completely. The reason was religious. To marry the heir to the throne of Russia, she would be required to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. She would be required to renounce the Lutheran faith in which she had been raised, the faith in which her mother had been buried, the faith which was the deepest possession of her interior life. She told Nicholas, as steadily as she could manage, that she could not do it. She could not give up her religion for a throne or for any other earthly reason. She loved him. She thought she could perhaps come to love him very deeply, in time, but she could not and would not change her faith for any man. He must not ask her again. He must, she said, find another bride. Nicholas, white-faced, told her that there would be no other bride. He would wait. She told him that he must not wait, that he must marry, that he must do his duty. He told her he would not. She left St. Petersburg the following week and travelled back to Darmstadt with her sister Victoria, who had come out to fetch her. She wept silently for most of the journey home. The next 4 years are sometimes called, by the historians who like to give phases their names, the years of the long refusal. They were years in which Nicholas, in St. Petersburg, continued to write Alex's name in his diary, and continued to refuse every other suggested bride. There were years in which Alex, in Darmstadt, lived under the steady pressure of the Russian family, who wrote her letters, who sent her presents, who arranged for her to be invited to Russian dynastic events, and of her own family, who were divided about the question. Her sister Ella, who had converted to Orthodoxy without difficulty upon her own marriage, and who was happy in Russia, urged her to reconsider. Her brother Ernie, who had become Grand Duke of Hesse upon their father's death in 1892, also urged her to reconsider. Her grandmother, Queen Victoria, almost alone among the senior relations, supported her in her refusal, not because the Queen approved of the Lutheran faith above the Orthodox one, but because the Queen, by then in her 70s, simply did not want Alex in Russia, did not want her at the mercy of a court she did not trust, did not want her to make the marriage that everyone else in the family was pressing on her. The Queen had seen one granddaughter go to Russia. She had not been comforted by the experience. She did not wish a second to follow Pumptrudek. But the pressure was constant, and the heart of the question kept altering. Alex had loved Nicholas in 1889, and she continued to love him through 1890 and 1891 and 1892 in the way that a young woman of her temperament loved without speaking of it, with all the force of her interior life turned toward an absent person, with no other suitor able to displace him. She wrote to him occasionally, she received his letters, she kept his photograph in her travelling case, she refused when refusal was required, in language that grew slightly more sorrowful each year and slightly less certain. The religious obstacle remained the obstacle she named. The personal feeling beneath the refusal grew. By 1893, when she was 21 and he was 25, she was no longer entirely sure she could continue to refuse him. She prayed about it in the chapel at Darmstadt. She walked with her brother Ernie in the gardens at Wolfsgarten and talked in fragments about the impossibility of her situation. She wrote to her grandmother that she was no longer at peace. The Queen, reading the letter at Windsor, understood at once that the long refusal was nearing its end, and she wrote a tender, exasperated reply telling Alex that whatever she decided would have her grandmother's love behind it, but that she should decide carefully, because there was no taking back a decision of this kind. The end of the refusal came at Coburg in April of 1894. Coburg was the ancestral home of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family, from which the British and Hessian royal lines both descended. The small town in central Germany was, that spring, the site of one of the great gatherings of the extended European royal family. Alex's brother Ernst Ludwig, Ernie, was marrying his cousin Princess Victoria Melita of Edinburgh, daughter of the Duke of Edinburgh and the Russian Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna. The wedding brought together a guest list that included Queen Victoria herself, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, the Prince and Princess of Wales, an enormous selection of Russian Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses, and the heir apparent to the Russian throne, who arrived at Coburg with the open intention of making one final attempt to persuade Alex to marry him. He had told his father, in the weeks before the visit, that this would be his last attempt. If she refused again, he would accept the refusal as final, and he would marry whoever his family chose for him. He arrived on the 4th of April. The wedding of Ernie and Victoria Melita was to be held on the 19th. There were 15 days. He made his first attempt to speak to Alex on the morning after his arrival, in the gardens of the Ehrenberg Palace, where she was walking with her Aunt Vicky. Alex saw him coming, made an excuse to her aunt, and turned aside before he could reach her. He tried again the following day. She avoided him. He tried again. By the third day, his courage was beginning to fail him. He asked his cousin Wilhelm, who had appointed himself the agent of the Russian-Hessian marriage, to intervene. Wilhelm spoke to Alex at length in a private room. He told her that the future of two empires depended on her decision. He told her in language he had not, perhaps, fully thought through that her refusal would be a refusal of God's evident plan. He told her that she was a romantic schoolgirl standing in the way of history, and that history would not wait. Alex listened with growing distress. She thanked her cousin Wilhelm and left the room weeping. On the morning of the 8th of April, Nicholas came to her in the small green drawing room at the Schloss. He had asked permission to see her alone. The rest of the family had withdrawn. He sat down beside her on a sofa and took her hand. He told her that he was making his final attempt. He told her that he loved her, that he had loved her since they were children, that he had refused every other bride for 5 years and would refuse every other bride for the rest of his life, that he could not imagine his life without her in it. He told her that the religious question was something they would find a way through, that she would not have to give up her relationship to God, only the outward form of it, and that the form of Orthodox worship would in time become as deep a comfort to her as the Lutheran form had been. He told her that he would do anything she asked. He told her that he was asking her one final time to marry him. She sat for a long time without speaking. Then she began to weep, and once she had begun, she could not stop. She wept for an hour. She wept for the long pressure of the 4 years she had spent refusing him. She wept for her mother, who had died before Alex could ever ask her what to do. She wept for the religious certainty that she had held so steadily, and that was beginning in that small green room to give way. She wept for Nicholas himself, whom she loved and whom she had been hurting for years, and she wept for the country she was about to agree to belong to, which she did not know and which she had no reason to trust. He held her. He did not let her go. He did not press her further. He simply waited, with his arm around her, until the weeping began to slow, and then she said, in a voice she would later describe as not entirely her own, yes. She had said yes. She would marry him. The long refusal had ended. The Russian family was overjoyed. Kaiser Wilhelm was triumphant. He believed, with characteristic vanity, that he had personally arranged the engagement. The Hessian family was relieved. Queen Victoria, when the telegram reached her at Windsor, sat down at her writing desk and wrote a brief, sad reply. "Very pleased, dearest Alex, if it is what you wish." Privately, she wrote in her journal that she could not entirely rid herself of the feeling that Alex was making a mistake, but she did not say so to her granddaughter, and within days she had begun the necessary correspondence with the Russian household to arrange for the religious instruction Alex would need over the summer, and for the formal announcement of the engagement to the European chancelleries. That summer was the happiest summer of Alex's life. She and Nicholas spent 6 weeks together in England, where Queen Victoria had insisted that the bride and groom should come to her at Windsor and Osborne so she could supervise the engagement personally. They walked in the gardens, they drove in carriages along the Long Walk, they sat together in the Durbar room while Alex wrote letters home, and Nicholas read English newspapers and tried to learn the rhythms of the household. His grandmother by marriage ran with such firm authority. They were photographed together in dozens of portraits, Alex in white, Nicholas in the uniform of a hussar of the guards, their two faces tilted toward each other with the simple, unfeigned happiness of two young people who have settled what was unsettled and found that the settlement does not disappoint. Alex wrote in her diary that she had never been so happy, that her grandmother's blessing had set the seal on everything, that the months of preparation ahead seemed to her a stretch of pure joy. She began her Russian lessons. She began her religious instruction with the priest Father Yanishev, sent over from St. Petersburg specifically for the purpose. She was a quick student. She learned the prayers of the Orthodox liturgy in transliterated Russian and then in Russian script. She learned the structure of the Mass. She learned the names of the saints whose icons she would soon be expected to know in any cathedral she entered. The faith began to become hers. The doctrinal difference between the Lutheranism in which she had been raised and the orthodoxy into which she was preparing to enter turned out, in the end, not to be the unbridgeable gulf she had feared. The deep familiar pieties she had carried since childhood, the trust in God's providence, the belief in the necessity of prayer, the conviction that suffering was a means rather than an end, were as present in the Orthodox tradition as they had been in the Lutheran one. She wrote to Nicholas that she felt increasingly that she was not so much converting as discovering an older form of the same thing. Nicholas returned to Russia in October. They had been engaged for 6 months. The wedding was to be the following summer. They had time. The court at St. Petersburg was preparing for the visit of Alex as the Tsarevich's bride. And at Darmstadt and Wolfsgarten, Alex was assembling her trousseau and her household. Everything was on schedule. Everything was for the first time in 5 years. Uncomplicated. The summer ended. Autumn began. And then, in the last week of October, a telegram arrived at Wolfsgarten from St. Petersburg with news that altered everything. Tsar Alexander III, the bridegroom's father, had been failing in health all autumn. He had been taken south to the imperial residence at Levadia, in the Crimea, in the hope that the warmer climate would help him to recover. The hope had not been borne out. He was dying. Alex was sent for at once. The marriage that had been planned for the following summer in St. Petersburg was now to take place, somehow, with whatever ceremony could be assembled in the time available, as quickly as possible, because Nicholas could not assume the throne unmarried, and because there was no possibility of his crowning without his Serena beside him. She left Darmstadt within 48 hours of the telegram, accompanied by her sister Victoria and a small Hessian household. They travelled by train across Germany, by ship across the Black Sea, by carriage from Sevastopol up the Crimean coast road. The journey took most of a week. She arrived at Levadia in the 3rd week of October, in driving rain, dressed in travelling black, exhausted and frightened. Nicholas met her at the carriage door. He was weeping. His father had perhaps 3 days left. Inside the palace, in a darkened bedroom that smelled of incense and medicine, the Tsar of all the Russias was preparing to die, and the family was preparing for what would have to be done next. The next 10 days were the most disorienting of Alex's life. The Tsar received the last sacraments on the morning of the 31st. He died on the afternoon of the 1st of November, with his wife at his side, his children around his bed, and Alex standing in the doorway behind them, holding Nicholas's hand. Nicholas was 26 years old. The weight of a sixth of the Earth's surface had passed to him in a single afternoon, with no preparation that he or anyone else in the room considered adequate. He turned to his cousin, Grand Duke Alexander, and said the words that have been recorded by every memoirist who heard them. "I am not ready. I know nothing of the business of ruling. I never wanted this. What is to become of Russia? What is to become of me?" She was received into the Orthodox Church on the following morning, the 2nd of November, in a private ceremony at the Levadia Chapel, attended by Nicholas and his sisters and a few members of the household. She received her new name and her new patronymic, Alexandra Fyodorovna, the name she would carry for the rest of her life, and she emerged from the chapel, half a Russian Grand Duchess and half a frightened German girl, still unsure of what was happening to her. The body of the dead Tsar was taken north by carriage to Sevastopol, by ship to Odessa, by train across the empire, by procession through every town and city the train passed through to Moscow first, where the coffin lay in state for 2 days, and then on to St. Petersburg, where it was to be buried in the imperial mausoleum at the Peter and Paul Cathedral. Alex and the rest of the family travelled with the coffin. She had not been in St. Petersburg as the Tsarevich's bride. She arrived as something between a betrothed and a bride and a mourner and a future empress, and she did not know which of those roles she was playing at any given moment. The Russian crowds lined the route from the station. They had been told that the new Tsar's German bride was travelling with the funeral train. They knew that she had converted only days before. They had not yet seen her face. She was driven from the station in a carriage at the head of the procession, dressed in deep black, her face white, her eyes red. The line of the people watching her in the November cold was 30 deep on either side of the street. They stared. They did not cheer. They were burying a Tsar. a phrase began to circulate in the streets of St. Petersburg in those first days. It came perhaps from the older women, from the peasant women who watched the procession from the side streets and who muttered to each other in the way. Older women in any country mutter about a foreign bride entering a household at a bad moment. "She comes to us behind a coffin," they said. "She comes to us behind a coffin." It became a phrase. It was repeated. It travelled. It became, in the way certain phrases become, a kind of folk superstition attached to her from the first week. She had not yet been married. She had not yet been crowned. She had done nothing to deserve a reputation in either direction. But the phrase fastened to her, and it did not let go. "She comes to us behind a coffin." Years later, when everything had gone wrong, the older women would remind each other that they had said so from the beginning. The funeral was held on the 19th of November. The wedding was held on the 26th, a week after the burial of the father of the groom. There had been some discussion of whether to delay. The Dowager Tsarina Maria Feodorovna had wanted the wedding postponed for a year of full mourning. The church authorities had ruled that no delay was permissible because the new Tsar was unmarried and the dynasty required an heir. Nicholas himself had wanted only to do whatever was correct. In the end, the wedding was held in the chapel of the Winter Palace, on the Dowager Tsarina's Saint's Day, with the court in deep mourning except for the bride and groom themselves. Alex wore the imperial wedding dress, silver brocade with a long train, the Kokoshnik diadem of diamonds, a veil of old lace, and Nicholas wore the red hussar uniform he had favoured. The aisle she walked down was lined with 2,000 wedding guests in black. Outside, the streets of St. Petersburg were hung with black banners for the late Tsar. The contrast, the silver bride at the centre of a cathedral of mourners, was so stark that several of the witnesses wrote afterwards that they had not been able to look directly at her. She seemed, one Russian Grand Duchess wrote, like a small white candle being carried through a procession of dark figures, lighting nothing, signifying nothing they could yet name. After the ceremony there was no honeymoon. Russian tradition did not permit a new sovereign to leave the capital in his first weeks of reign, and a court in deep mourning would have considered a wedding journey indecent. Nicholas and Alexandra, she was Alexandra now, no longer Alex, spent their wedding night at the Anitkov Palace, in a small suite of rooms placed at their disposal by the Dowager Tsarina, who lived in the rest of the palace. They were not given a household of their own. They were not given even a sitting room they could call entirely their own. The new Tsarina was a guest in the apartments of her mother-in-law, with whom relations had been correct and were about to become difficult. The first weeks of their marriage were spent in close quarters with the Dowager Tsarina's grief, with the court's mourning, with the unending official business that a new Tsar had to transact, and with the slow physical exhaustion of two newlyweds who had buried a parent the week before, and had assumed the throne the week before that, and had not had a single hour in their married life that was not also a public hour. Alexandra wrote to her grandmother that winter in the steady, restrained handwriting she had been taught in English schoolrooms. "Our marriage seems to me a continuation of the service for the dead, with only this difference, that I wore white and the others wore black. I had stood at the bedside of his father. I had been received into his church. I had been blessed by his mother. I am Alexandra Feodorovna now. I am the Tsarina of all the Russias. I cannot quite make myself understand what these words mean. Pray for me. Pray for him. Pray for the country into which we have both, in the space of a fortnight, been throned." The coronation was set for May of 1896. 18 months had passed since the death of Alexander III. The formal mourning had ended. The imperial family had moved to Moscow for the ceremonies of the crowning, which were held by Russian custom in the ancient capital rather than in St. Petersburg. Moscow had been preparing for months. The streets had been swept, the buildings whitewashed, the public fountains repaired. Triumphal arches had been erected at every major crossing. The Kremlin itself, which was to be the heart of the celebrations, had been hung with cloth of gold and ivory silk. The cathedral of the Dormition, where the crowning would take place, had been polished and gilded and freshly censed. The whole city, on the day Nicholas and Alexandra arrived from St. Petersburg, smelt of incense and beeswax and fresh paint. The crowds along the route from the railway station to the Kremlin gates were estimated at 500,000 people. Alexandra rode beside Nicholas in an open carriage drawn by white horses, in a Russian court dress of cream silk, with a sapphire and diamond diadem on her head and a long train carried by 4 pages. The cheering was deafening. She did not look up. The ceremony itself was held on the 14th of May in the Cathedral of the Dormition, in the presence of every reigning house of Europe and most of the senior representatives of every reigning house outside Europe: the Crown Prince of Greece, the Crown Prince of Romania, the heir apparent of Italy, the Prince of Wales, the Crown Prince of Germany. The service ran for 5 hours. Nicholas was crowned first, with the crown of Catherine the Great placed on his head by the Metropolitan of Moscow. He then took a smaller crown from a velvet cushion and placed it on Alexandra's head himself, in the moment that made her formally the Tsarina of all the Russias. She knelt before him as the smaller crown was set on her hair. Then she stood. Then she walked, side by side with him, around the cathedral, kissing the icons in the prescribed order. The orchestra in the gallery played the Te Deum. The choir sang. The diamond drops of the long earrings she had been given to wear by her mother-in-law dragged at her ears for so long that by the end of the ceremony she could feel them tearing slowly through the lobes. There is a photograph taken outside the cathedral immediately after the crowning that has survived. Alexandra is in her full coronation robes, the imperial mantle of cloth of gold over her shoulders, the small crown on her head. Her face is white. Her expression is the expression of a woman who has been on her feet under the weight of 50 pounds of ceremonial vestments for the better part of a day. She is not smiling. She is not, in any visible way, triumphant. She is enduring. The photograph was widely reproduced in the Russian press in the weeks that followed, and it was perhaps the first public image of her that the Russian people had a chance to study closely. The reception was not warm. She looks tired, the people said. She looks haughty. She does not love us. The German woman, they said. Why does the German woman not smile? 4 days later, on the 18th of May, the people's celebration of the coronation was held at the Kodinka Field, a piece of waste ground on the western outskirts of Moscow that had been used since the time of Peter the Great for the distribution of imperial gifts to the populace on great occasions. The plan was a familiar one. 500,000 enamelled coronation mugs had been produced, each one bearing the imperial monogram, each one filled with sweets and a coin and a souvenir handkerchief. They were to be distributed free to the people of Moscow, who would assemble at dawn at the booths around the edges of the field, where the gifts would be handed out at a signal. There were not enough booths. There had never been enough booths for the size of crowd that gathered on these occasions. There were, on the morning of the 18th of May, perhaps 400,000 people pressed into a space that the planners had estimated would hold half that. A rumour ran through the crowd, in the darkness before dawn, that there were not enough mugs to go round. The crowd surged toward the booths. The ground beneath the crowd was uneven. There were drainage ditches under the surface, half filled in from a previous use of the field as a military exercise ground. People fell into the ditches. Others stepped on them. The crush spread outward. By the time the troops arrived to restore order, more than 1,000 of the people of Moscow who had come that morning to greet their new Tsar and Tsarina had been killed. The estimate now is closer to 1,400. They were almost all poor. They were almost all there because they had been told that the Tsarina herself would appear later in the morning to bless them, and because they had wanted to be near the front when she did. The news reached the imperial party at the Petrovsky Palace within hours. Nicholas wept. Alexandra, who had been told of the disaster by her brother-in-law Sergei, the Governor-General of Moscow, sat down at a table and could not speak for some time. The two of them wished, immediately and instinctively, to cancel all further celebrations. They wished to spend the day in prayer for the dead. They wished to visit the hospitals where the injured had been taken. They wished above everything to be seen to grieve for the people who had died trying to reach them. The decision was taken from their hands. The senior ministers of the household and behind them, the senior members of the imperial family, led by Sergei himself, who could not afford to have the magnitude of the disaster acknowledged because the responsibility for it lay primarily with his administration, argued that to cancel the evening celebrations would be politically unwise. The French ambassador had organized a great ball at the embassy in honor of the new sovereigns. The French government had sent the president's brother to attend it. To cancel would be to insult the French alliance, which had been the cornerstone of Russian foreign policy since 1891. Nicholas, hesitating, asked his uncle Vladimir what he should do. Vladimir told him to go to the ball. Alexandra, when Nicholas told her of the decision, said only that she would do whatever he thought right. They went to the ball. They danced one waltz. They left at the earliest possible moment. The photographs taken at the embassy that evening show Alexandra in white satin, her face the colour of the satin, her eyes lowered, her hand resting on her husband's arm as if she would have fallen without it. The Russian press, on the orders of the censors, did not report that the imperial couple had attended the ball at all. The Moscow rumour, however, reported nothing else. It was said in the streets the next morning that the new Tsar had danced while his people were being buried, that the new Tsarina had worn her diamonds at a French embassy, while peasant mothers searched the morgues for their children, that the imperial couple had no feeling for Russia and never would. The story passed from person to person. It travelled with the crowds returning to their villages after the coronation. It became, within the space of a week, the second story attached to the new Tsarina, the German woman who had come behind a coffin and who had danced after the disaster at Kodinka. 2 stories. They were already, by the end of her first month as an anointed empress, enough to begin building a reputation that nothing she did afterwards would entirely erase. She did not understand the damage that had been done. She visited the hospitals over the following days, sitting at the bedsides of the injured and dying, distributing money to the families of the dead, ordering masses for the souls of the trampled, paying privately for the funerals of those whose families could not afford them. She did all of these things with sincerity, and at her own expense. None of them registered. The press, controlled by the court, did not report her hospital visits. The streets, which by then preferred their version of the story, did not believe the rumours of charity even when they heard them. She wrote to her sister Victoria in England that she had never felt so helpless in her life, that she had wanted to help, that she had tried to help, that she had been told her help was being delivered, and yet it seemed to have reached no one. Her sister, reading the letter at her own household in Hampshire, recognised the situation immediately for what it was. She wrote back that the people who had been killed at Kodinka were not Alex's responsibility, and that the obligation Alex felt to be answerable for them was a generous instinct but not, in any reasonable sense, a fair burden. Alex kept the letter. She was not consoled by it. The first daughter had been born 7 months before the coronation, in the autumn after the wedding. Olga Nikolaevna was born at Tsarskoye Selo on the 15th of November 1895. Alexandra had been pregnant within 4 months of the wedding, and the country had been waiting for the announcement of an heir with the intensity that Russian dynastic politics always devoted to such matters. The expectation had not been for a daughter. The pregnancy itself had been difficult. Alexandra had been ill with sciatica through the autumn, and the labour had been long and frightening, but the child had been delivered alive and healthy, and on the afternoon of her birth the cannon at the Peter and Paul fortress had fired the salute of 101 shots that announced the birth of a Grand Duchess. The salute of 300 shots was reserved for the birth of a Grand Duke. The Russian people, hearing the cannon stop at 101, sighed and went home. It was only a daughter. There would be another time. Alexandra adored her. The shock of becoming a mother, the absolute physical immediacy of the small living creature that had been handed to her by the midwife, overwhelmed every other consideration in her life. She had been raised in an English nursery. She had been raised by Mrs. Orchard, who had run the Hessian nursery on the same lines. She had been told for years by her grandmother that an aristocratic mother was a distant figure in her children's lives, and properly so. None of that mattered, now that the child was in her arms. She insisted, against the firm advice of the Russian court, on nursing Olga herself for the first weeks. She insisted on the cradle being placed beside her own bed at night. She insisted on bathing the baby herself, on changing her, on being present for every feeding. She had become, in a single afternoon, the kind of mother her own mother had been to her and to May, and the discovery that motherhood was the role of her life lay underneath everything else she became from that day forward. The court considered it eccentric. The court considered most of what she did to be eccentric. She did not care. The second daughter was born 18 months later. Tatiana Nikolaevna arrived at Peterhof on the 10th of June 1897. She was easier to deliver than Olga had been. She was, by every account, the most beautiful of the imperial daughters as an infant. She had the heavy dark hair of her father's family and the same fine features of her mother. Alexandra was once again radiantly happy. The Tsar was less happy. He had hoped for a son. The cannon on Tatiana's birthday fired 101 shots again. The country was beginning to wonder. The third daughter, Maria Nikolaevna, arrived at Peterhof on the 26th of June 1899, and at 101 shots the country was no longer wondering. The country was openly disappointed. The fourth daughter, Anastasia Nikolaevna, arrived at Peterhof on the 18th of June 1901. She was a small baby, the smallest of the four. She was loud and merry from her first hours. She would grow up to be the most boisterous of the imperial daughters and the most photographed in private snapshots. Her birth was the fourth disappointment. The country had begun to ask by then whether the foreign Tsarina was capable of producing the heir for whom the dynasty was waiting. The question was not asked in the imperial family. Nicholas adored his daughters and never spoke of disappointment, but it was asked in the salons of St. Petersburg, in the country houses of the great families, in the foreign embassies, and ultimately in the streets. Alexandra was aware of the question. She was the more aware of it for the silence of her husband on the subject. She prayed for a son. She wrote to her sister Victoria that she could not understand why God was withholding from her the single thing she wanted. She began to attend Orthodox services with increasing intensity. She developed a private devotion to the saints of Russian motherhood that exceeded the formal piety expected of a Tsarina and crossed into the territory of something close to obsession. She wanted a son. She was 30 in the year Anastasia was born. She had 4 daughters. She had not yet given Russia an heir. Pressure on her was enormous, and most of it she was generating from inside herself. In the long evenings she spent on her knees in the small chapel of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. The household had moved by then to Tsarskoye Selo. The Tsar's village, 15 miles south of St. Petersburg, had been used as a country residence by every imperial family since Catherine the Great. The Alexander Palace, built by Catherine for her grandson, had become the favoured residence of Nicholas and Alexandra in the years after the births of their first children. It was a smaller, more comfortable building than the Catherine Palace next door, with its rooms scaled for family life rather than for state ceremony, its windows opening onto deep parkland, its corridors quiet and underused. Nicholas and Alexandra preferred it to the formal palaces of St. Petersburg. They moved their growing family there permanently in 1900. They would never again live in any other house for more than a few weeks at a time. The Alexander Palace, with its long gravel drive and its private gardens and its high walls, became, for Alexandra, the only home in Russia she ever felt entirely at peace in. It would also become, in the fullness of time, her prison. The retreat to Tsarskoye Selo had social consequences. The court of St. Petersburg had expected, from a young imperial couple, a great deal of public visibility balls at the Winter Palace, dinners at the great mansions, the regular round of seasonal entertainments that had marked every reign for 2 centuries. Alexandra had no taste for any of it. She found large gatherings exhausting. She found small, intimate gatherings tolerable. She preferred above all the company of her own family. She and Nicholas began in the early years of the new century to cut back on official entertainment. They held fewer balls. They went to fewer dinners. They withdrew. The great hostesses of St. Petersburg, who lived for imperial favour and for the chance to receive their sovereigns in their drawing rooms, took the withdrawal personally. They began to talk. They said that the Tsarina had no manners, that she found Russia distasteful, that she preferred her German habits to her adopted country, that she was cold, that she was haughty, that she would not bow to Russian society. None of it was true in the form in which it was said. All of it had a kernel of truth in the form that lay underneath. Alexandra was reserved. She did find large court occasions exhausting. She did prefer the small, intimate life of her family at Tsarskoye Selo to the splendours of St. Petersburg. She did, in her private moments, think that some of the manners of the Russian court were brittle and superficial in ways the English and German courts had never been. She was, in short, exactly the kind of empress that the society of her capital was guaranteed not to forgive. The 4 daughters grew up at Tsarskoye Selo in conditions that would have surprised anyone who imagined the daughters of the Tsar of Russia to be raised in any particular grandeur. They slept 2 to a bedroom. Olga and Tatiana, the older pair, in one room, Maria and Anastasia, the younger pair, in another. Their beds were narrow camp beds without pillows, on the instructions of their mother, who believed that hard, simple sleeping was the foundation of a healthy upbringing. They wore plain cotton dresses, often passed down from elder sister to younger sister. They were taught by an English governess and a Russian one. They were taken to church every Sunday and to country walks every afternoon. They had a small menagerie of dogs and a pony each. They had each other, and they had their mother, who insisted on being present for at least one meal of the day with them and who came in to read aloud at night before bed. They were, by every account that has survived from the household, an extraordinarily happy quartet of small girls. They had been given the collective nickname Oatma by their mother, an acronym formed from the first letters of their 4 names, and they signed their letters home with the 4-letter sign. They squabbled, of course. They teased Anastasia, the youngest, was the family's clown, and her elder sister's patience with her elaborate practical jokes was variable. But the household photographs that have come down to us, and a great many photographs were taken, because Nicholas was a keen amateur photographer who carried his camera everywhere, show 4 girls in white pinafores moving about the gardens at Tsarskoye Selo and Peterhof and Livadia in a tight little squadron, hand in hand, in birth order, in dresses that matched. They were known in the court as the 4 little Grand Duchesses. They were almost never seen separately, and never in adult company for more than the necessary hour after tea. It would be wrong, however, to think of them only as a quartet. They had 4 distinct natures, and the closer one looked at them, the more separate they became. Olga, the eldest, was the imperial mind of the 4. She was the most intellectual. She read voraciously from the age of 9. She had inherited her mother's seriousness about religion and her father's modesty of bearing. She was fair-haired like Alexandra, with the same fine features and the same shy turn of the head when addressed in company, and as she grew into adolescence, she developed a thoughtfulness about the future of her country that her sisters never quite shared. She kept a notebook of poems she had copied out by hand, mostly Russian poets, Pushkin, Lermontov, Tyutchev, and at 14 she began composing her own verses, which she showed only to her mother and to her tutor. Her letters home from Livadia in 1909 are full of attentive observations about the weather, the wildflowers, the books she was reading, and the conversations she had had with the household servants whose first names she always remembered. She was, by general agreement among the household, the daughter most like her mother in temperament, reserved, intense, religious, but with a streak of clear-eyed political intelligence that Alexandra herself had never possessed. By 18, when the war began, Olga had developed her own opinions about Russian politics, opinions she did not share at court, but which she discussed with her father in long evening walks at Tsarskoye Selo, and her father, who had begun those walks expecting to indulge a daughter, found himself drawing on her counsel by the 2nd year of the war. Tatiana was different. Tatiana was the household's manager from the time she could walk. She was tall, dark-haired, slim, with what every contemporary observer remembered as the most beautiful face of the 4 sisters and the most reserved manner of any of them. She had absorbed her mother's competence without her mother's interior anxiety. She ran her own life and most of her sisters' lives with calm efficiency from the age of 12. It was Tatiana who organized the schedules of the family's domestic existence in the years before the war, who reminded her sisters of their lessons, who supervised the kitchen menus on her mother's bad days, who wrote out the seating arrangements for family meals when guests were visiting. The household nickname for her was the governess, given to her by her sister Anastasia in tones of affection mixed with exasperation. She was the daughter who made the rest of the family work. During the war years, when Alexandra's strength was failing, Tatiana absorbed an increasing share of the practical management of the household at Tsarskoye Selo, and during the captivity it was Tatiana, more than any of the others, who held the household together in its long descent through Tobolsk and Yekaterinburg, settling quarrels, organizing meals, calming her younger siblings. Maria, the 3rd daughter, was the family's mediator. She was the most placid of the 4, fair-haired like her mother and grandmother. with very large dark blue eyes, the same eyes the family Dr. Botkin once described as the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen on a Russian face, and a temperament so unfailingly tender that her sisters teased her for it. She loved everyone. She wanted everyone to be happy. She was the one who, when Olga and Tatiana quarreled, walked between them and made them apologize. She was the one who, when Anastasia drove her tutors to despair, sat with the tutor afterwards and explained that Anastasia had not meant to be rude. She had her grandmother Maria Fyodorovna's name, but very little of that energetic matriarch's temperament. She had instead her great-grandmother Alice's gift for affection without complication. The household sailors at Livadia, who had been with the family for years and who knew the children intimately, agreed among themselves that Maria was the one any of them would have most willingly died for. She would in the end be the daughter who travelled with her parents from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg in advance of her sisters, a separation she bore without complaint, and which her father remembered in the diary entries he kept at the Ipatiev house as the act of a daughter older than her years. Anastasia, the youngest, was the family's clown. She was short for her age, dark-haired, fast-moving, capable of mimicking any voice and any accent in the household, and she lived to make her sisters laugh. The dignified photographs of the imperial family in official poses concealed, behind them, hours of preparation in which Anastasia had been told by her sisters and her tutor to please, for once, sit still. She rarely managed it. She was the daughter most often photographed laughing in private snapshots, the one whose face appeared at odd angles in the corners of family pictures, the one who pulled faces at her mother during church services and who had to be reproached by her sister Olga for irreverence. She had inherited her father's sense of humour, his fondness for practical jokes, and his refusal to take seriously the public ceremony that surrounded their lives. Her tutors thought her undisciplined. Her mother defended her. Anastasia would grow into the most spirited of the four daughters, and her name would, after the deaths of all the family, become the most exploited name in 20th century imposture, as a succession of women across Europe and America claimed for decades to be the lost youngest Grand Duchess. None of them, of course, were. But the persistence of the legend tells you something about the place she had occupied in the imaginations of those who had known the family, the laughing youngest daughter, the one who had refused to be solemn even at her own grandmother's funeral, the one nobody could quite believe was simply gone. Together they formed a household few outsiders ever entered. Most of their friends were members of the household staff. Anna Virubova, the lady-in-waiting who had become Alexandra's closest companion and whom the daughters called Auntie Anya, the children's tutor Pierre Gilliard, who had begun teaching them French in 1905 and who would still be with them in Tobolsk, the sailor attendants of Alexei, with whom the four sisters had grown up, the doctors Botkin and Derivenko, who were almost family figures by the time the children were adolescents. Of friends their own age outside the household they had almost none. They saw their cousins occasionally, the daughters of the Tsar's sister Zinnia, who lived with their parents in St. Petersburg, the children of Ella, who was a widow and a nun by then. They did not attend balls. They did not have school friends. The world they knew was the world of the Alexander Palace, the Livadia residence in Crimea, the imperial yacht Standart on which they spent summers in Finnish waters, and the long train journeys between these places. The world outside that circle they knew about only through books and their tutors' descriptions. They were perhaps the most secluded daughters in any reigning house of their generation in Europe, and the seclusion was a deliberate decision by their parents, who believed it would protect them. In one sense it did. In another sense it would when the political upheaval came, leave them entirely unprepared for any life that was not the life they had been raised in. Their mother was the centre of their world. Alexandra was the kind of mother her own mother Alice had been to her, devoted, present, attentive, religious, watchful, slightly anxious. She wrote in her diary every night about each daughter in turn, what they had said that day, what they had read, whether they had quarrelled, whether anyone had cried. She made their birthday cakes herself, with help from the household cooks. She supervised their religious education personally. She prayed with them at bedtime. She had become, within 6 years of becoming a mother, almost exclusively a mother. The role of empress fell on her in public moments, but the role of mother had become her whole interior life. She wrote to her sister Victoria, in a letter that has survived, that she could not believe how completely her daughters had absorbed her. "There is nothing in the world," she wrote, "that I would not do for one of them. There is nothing in the world more important to me than that they should be happy." And, she added, in a sentence that her sister later underlined heavily in pencil, "I do not know what I would do if one of them were taken from me. I think I would not survive it." She had 4 daughters. She was loved by her husband. She was 32 years old. She had been Empress of Russia for 7 years. She had not yet given Russia a son. By the summer of 1903, she had begun to fear that she would not in fact be able to give Russia a son. The question hung over her every prayer. It accompanied her on every visit to the imperial chapels. It troubled the household physicians who had been quietly monitoring her health since the birth of Anastasia. She made a pilgrimage that summer to a small monastery at Sarov, in the Russian countryside south of Moscow, where a holy man named Seraphim had lived a century earlier and whose canonization Nicholas had recently approved. She prayed at the saint's tomb. She bathed in the cold spring that ran through the monastery grounds. She returned to Tsarskoye Selo in early August, exhausted and hopeful. By Christmas she was pregnant. She believed, throughout the pregnancy, that the saint of Sarov had answered her prayer. She would not be persuaded otherwise. The child was born at Peterhof on the morning of the 12th of August 1904. The cannon at the Peter and Paul fortress fired 300 shots. Russia exhaled. The child was a son. He was christened Alexei Nikolaevich. He weighed 11 pounds at birth. He was a large, healthy baby. His godparents were the Emperor of Germany, the King of Denmark, the Prince of Wales, and the Tsar's eldest sister. The whole of Russia rejoiced. There were Te Deums in every cathedral. There were public holidays declared. The dynasty had its heir. The Tsarina had given the country what it had been waiting for. Alexandra wrote to her grandmother in England that her happiness was perfect, that her prayer had been answered, that the saint of Sarov had been good to her, that everything that had been difficult about her life as empress now seemed to her a small thing she would willingly have endured 10 times over for the result. She had become, in the space of a single morning, the mother of the heir. The future, for the first time since her arrival in Russia, seemed to her to be entirely open. The future was not entirely open. 6 weeks after Alexei's birth, in the last week of September, the umbilical stump on his abdomen began to bleed. The bleeding had been expected. The stump had detached itself at the usual time. The small wound at the navel had begun to weep blood, in the way such wounds do for an hour or two and then close. This wound did not close. It bled for 2 days. It was bandaged. It bled through the bandage. It was bandaged again. It bled again. By the 3rd day, the imperial physicians had been called. By the end of the week, they had reached, with sombre faces, the diagnosis they had been hoping not to reach. The child had hemophilia. He had inherited from his mother, through his mother from his grandmother, through his grandmother from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, the disorder of the blood that had killed Alexandra's small brother Fritti at Darmstadt 31 years earlier. The condition was, in 1904, untreatable. There were no transfusions. There was no clotting factor. There was bandaging and rest and prayer. The diagnosis was not spoken aloud in the imperial household. It was discussed only between Nicholas, Alexandra, the senior court physician Yevgeny Botkin, and one or two other intimates. It was not to be spoken of beyond the walls of the Alexander Palace. The country was not to be told. The dynasty's heir was not to be known to be ill. The reasoning, Nicholas's reasoning, supported uneasily by his wife, was political. A haemophiliac heir was in the Russia of 1904, an heir whose long-term capacity to rule would be openly questioned. The political enemies of the dynasty would use the diagnosis. The political allies of the dynasty would lose confidence. The international position of Russia, already precarious because of the war with Japan that had begun in February of that year, would be further damaged. Better, Nicholas and Alexandra agreed to keep the diagnosis a secret of the household, to manage the boy's care privately, and to hope that he would survive into adulthood and that medicine would, in his lifetime, find a cure. It was a decision they would come to regret. The keeping of the secret meant that every absence of the boy from a public event, every cancellation of an imperial appearance because Alexei was unwell, every visible favor the imperial parents gave to the people they trusted with their son's health, looked to the outside world like inexplicable and arbitrary behavior. It meant that the family withdrew further from St. Petersburg society than they had been doing already. It meant that Alexandra, who had been considered eccentric in her parenting, was now considered hysterical in her devotion to her son. It meant that when, in 1905, a wandering peasant from Siberia was introduced to the imperial household by friends of the family who had heard he could ease the boy's suffering, when that peasant, by means no doctor of any school has ever satisfactorily explained, did in fact appear repeatedly to ease the boy's suffering, Alexandra's faith in him became total, and the country never understood why, because the country had not been told what the man was being trusted to do. The secret of Alexei's illness was the seed of every catastrophe that followed, but that secret was still in the future, in the autumn of 1904. The boy was alive. The first bleeding episode passed. The naval wound, after weeks of bandaging, finally closed. The country was rejoicing in the birth of its Tsarevich without yet having heard the diagnosis. The household at Tsarskoye Selo was, in those first months, a household full of relief and triumph. Nicholas wrote in his diary that he had not been so happy since his wedding. Alexandra, holding the small son she had prayed for, walked the corridors of the Alexander Palace in a state of physical bliss that her ladies-in-waiting later remembered as a kind of slow, steady radiance, the radiance of a woman whose deepest prayer has finally been answered, and who has not yet been forced to understand the answer in its full shape. The year 1905 broke over Russia like the first frost of a long winter. The war with Japan, which had begun the year before with such confidence on the Russian side, was going catastrophically wrong. The Russian Pacific Fleet had been bottled up in Port Arthur for most of the previous 12 months, and had been largely destroyed when the port fell in January. The Baltic Fleet, sent halfway round the world to relieve it, would be annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima in May. The army in Manchuria was being defeated in a series of large, brutal engagements that the Russian public had been told to expect victories from. Casualties were mounting. The newspapers, even the controlled ones, could no longer disguise the scale of the losses. By the beginning of January 1905, Russia was a country reading reports of military disaster every week, and the public mood in the cities had hardened into something that no government had yet faced. On the morning of the 9th of January 1905, a procession of unarmed factory workers and their families, led by a parish priest named Georgy Gapon, walked through the snow of central St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. They were carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar. They were singing hymns. They had drawn up a petition to be presented to Nicholas in person, asking him to grant them an 8-hour working day, a fair wage, and the right to be represented in the management of the factories where they worked. There were perhaps 100,000 of them. They believed, with a deep peasant trust that had survived every Russian century, that if they could only reach the Tsar himself, if they could only stand before him and place their petition in his hands, he would understand and help them. They believed it as an article of faith. The Tsar, the Little Father, would not abandon his people. The Tsar would set things right. The Tsar was not at the Winter Palace. He was at Tsarskoye Selo with his family, on the recommendation of his ministers, who had known the procession was coming, and who had not informed him of the full nature of what was approaching. The troops stationed at the bridges and squares of central St. Petersburg were under orders to disperse the crowd. The orders were carried out in stages with rifles. The crowd had come to ask the Tsar for help. By evening, the snow in front of the Winter Palace was no longer only snow. The official figures gave the dead at less than 200. The unofficial figures ran to several times that. The truth, like the truth of so many Russian disasters, was never settled. The date entered Russian history under the name it would always carry afterwards, Bloody Sunday. The day on which the bond between the people and the Tsar was broken in a way that no subsequent gesture, no apology, no policy concession would ever fully mend. Nicholas received the news at Tsarskoye Selo in the late afternoon. He had not given the order to fire. He had not been told the procession was coming. He understood at once that the damage to his position was catastrophic. He wrote in his diary that he was filled with grief. He ordered an immediate inquiry. He received a delegation of workers a few days later and expressed his sorrow at what had happened. None of it mattered. The peasant faith in the Tsar, the faith that had been the foundation of every Romanov reign for 300 years, had been broken in the course of a single morning. The country knew now that the soldiers of the imperial household had fired on an unarmed religious procession of their own countrymen. The country knew that men and women carrying icons had been shot in front of the home of the Tsar. The country did not, in the end, much care whether Nicholas had or had not given the order. He was the Tsar. The soldiers were his. The blood was his. The year that followed was the year that came closest before the year 1917 to overthrowing the Romanov dynasty. Strikes spread from St. Petersburg to Moscow and from Moscow to the provincial cities. Peasant revolts broke out across the agricultural districts. Sailors mutinied. The battleship Potemkin in the Black Sea Fleet rose in revolt against its officers and steamed up the coast as a free vessel for several days. In Moscow, in October, a general strike paralyzed the city. The railway workers struck across the whole empire. The telegraph offices closed. The country could not function. Nicholas, faced with the choice between massive military repression and constitutional concession, in October he issued the manifesto that promised civil liberties, a representative assembly, the Duma, and a constitutional framework that, on paper at least, transformed Russia from an autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. He signed it in his diary with a heavy hand. He had not wanted to. His mother had argued against it. His wife had wept and called it the betrayal of his coronation oath. He had signed it because the alternative had been civil war, and because his ministers had told him that a constitutional monarchy was still a monarchy, and because he was, at the end of it all, exhausted. Alexandra never forgave the constitutional concession. She believed, with the deep conviction of a woman who had taken her marriage vows in an Orthodox cathedral and her coronation oath at the same altar, that the autocracy had been entrusted to her husband by God, that to share it with a Duma was to break the oath he had sworn at his coronation, that the country needed not constitutional reform but a stronger autocrat. She wrote letters to Nicholas in the years that followed the 1905 manifesto, in which she returned again and again to the same theme. He was the master. He must be the master. He must not give way to weakness. He must rule, she wrote in English, which was the language they used in their private correspondence, a habit acquired in their courtship that they never broke. Be Peter the Great. Be Ivan the Terrible. Be Emperor Paul, she wrote in one famous letter. Crush them all. Sweep them away. Show them who is master. She believed it. He, mostly, did not. The marriage was held together by deep love and shared faith. The marriage was not held together by political agreement. It was in this atmosphere, the atmosphere of 1905 and 1906, the atmosphere of a country in which the dynasty's hold on its people had been visibly broken, and in which the Tsarina was in a state of almost continuous spiritual distress about both the country and her son, that the figure of Grigory Rasputin entered the imperial family's life. The introduction happened, as such introductions usually happen, through a chain of intermediaries. There were two cousins at the Russian court, two Montenegrin princesses, the wives of two Grand Dukes, named Militsa and Anastasia, and known in the family by their first names. They were sisters, they were Orthodox, they were interested in mysticism and in the various holy men and women who circulated through Russian society in those years, claiming the gift of prayer and prophecy. They had introduced Alexandra to several such figures before. None had taken root. The Montenegrin sisters mentioned in the autumn of 1905 that they had met a peasant from the Tobolsk district of Siberia who was reputed to have remarkable powers of healing. He was being talked about in certain devout circles in St. Petersburg. They thought Alexandra ought to meet him. They arranged an introduction at one of their houses in the early winter. His name was Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. He was a peasant from the village of Pokrovskoye in western Siberia, perhaps 36 years old, with a long unkempt beard, deep grey-blue eyes that everyone who met him remembered for the rest of their lives, and a coarse country manner of speech that he never modified for any company. He had been a wanderer in his early life, one of those Russian religious wanderers who walked the roads of the empire from monastery to monastery, sleeping in barns, eating what they were given, praying as they walked. He had a wife and children in Pokrovskoye. He had no formal education. He was, at the time of his introduction to Alexandra, beginning to attract the attention of the religious establishment of St. Petersburg, who were divided about him. Some senior clergy believed he was a genuine holy man, a starets in the old Russian tradition. Others believed he was a charlatan and a danger. His personal life was already attracting unfavourable comment. He drank. He spent time with women who were not his wife. He told stories about himself that did not always agree with each other. Alexandra met him in November 1905. The meeting took place at the house of Militsa, in the presence of Nicholas as well. The conversation lasted perhaps 2 hours. Rasputin spoke about prayer, about the obligation of suffering, about the simple piety of the Russian peasantry from whom he came. He spoke directly. He looked Alexandra in the eyes without dropping his gaze, which no one in her court ever did. He addressed Nicholas as Batyushka, little father, which no one in her court ever did either. He gave her a small icon and asked her to keep it near her. He told her that he would pray for her. He left. She and Nicholas talked about him afterwards. She found him deeply impressive. Nicholas was uncertain. He reserved his judgment. They saw him again, in similar circumstances, several times over the following 2 years. Alexandra became attached to him. Nicholas remained reserved. But neither of them, in those first 2 years of acquaintance, took him into the household. He was a religious figure they met occasionally. He was not yet anything more. The event that turned him into something more was the bleeding crisis of October 1907. Alexei, who was 3 years old, had fallen and hurt his leg while playing in the gardens of the Alexander Palace. The bleeding inside the joint was severe. The leg swelled. The pain became, within hours, more than the small child could bear. The court physicians did everything they knew how to do, which in 1907 amounted to bandaging, immobilizing the joint, and waiting. The waiting was the worst part. Alexei screamed for 2 days. Alexandra did not leave his bedside. She did not sleep. The physicians began by the second night to be openly concerned that the child would not survive the episode. Alexandra, in her desperation, sent a telegram to Militsa asking her to summon Rasputin from his rooms in St. Petersburg. Rasputin came at once. He stood at the foot of the boy's bed. He prayed. He spoke to Alexei in a low voice that the household physicians could not entirely make out. Within an hour, the screaming had stopped. Within 12 hours, the swelling had begun to go down. Within 3 days, Alexei was sitting up in bed and asking for his dogs. No physician of any school of medicine has, in the century since, satisfactorily explained how this happened. It happened again. It happened, in fact, repeatedly. Every time Alexei had a bleeding crisis severe enough that the physicians feared for his life, Rasputin was sent for, and every time, by means that have been argued about by historians and physicians for a century, Rasputin appeared to ease the crisis. The most spectacular instance occurred in October 1912 at Spala in Poland, where the imperial family was on holiday. Alexei had jolted his thigh climbing into a boat. The resulting internal bleeding had been the worst he had ever suffered. For 10 days he hovered between life and death. The last sacraments were administered. The bulletin announcing his death had been drafted. Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin in Siberia, where he was at his home village. Rasputin telegraphed back, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." Within hours of the receipt of the telegram, Alexei's temperature began to drop, the swelling began to recede, and within a week he was out of danger. Alexandra never doubted from that day forward that Rasputin's prayers stood between her son and death. She had told her sister Victoria years before that she did not know what she would do if one of her children were taken from her. Rasputin was the man whose prayers, she believed, kept Alexei from being taken. There was no human price too high to pay for that service. There was nothing the country could say about him that would make her give him up. But the country said a great deal about him. Rasputin's behavior in Petersburg between 1907 and 1916 was, by any sober historical reckoning, a public scandal of considerable proportions. He drank heavily. He kept the company of women of every social class, from grand duchesses to women on the margins of society, often in the same evening. He used his position as the Tsarina's spiritual confidant to extract favors, money, and influence from people who hoped to gain access to the imperial court through him. He boasted in taverns about his familiarity with the imperial family, using crude language that, when it was reported back, made the senior members of the family wince. He had been investigated more than once by the church authorities and by the police. The dossiers compiled on him would have ended any other public career in Russia immediately. They did not end his. They could not end his because Alexandra would not permit it. Every time Nicholas was persuaded by his ministers or by his own family that Rasputin must be sent away, Alexandra intervened, often weeping. She reminded her husband of what Rasputin's prayers had done for Alexei. She told him that to remove Rasputin would be to remove the only thing standing between their son and death. And Nicholas, who loved his wife and who could not bear her suffering, gave way every time. The court and the Duma and the country watched the cycle repeat itself for years, and the conclusion they drew eventually was the conclusion that any country watching such a cycle would have drawn. The Tsarina had fallen under the influence of a fraudulent peasant. The Tsar was unable to control his wife. The dynasty was being run behind the scenes by an illiterate Siberian who had bewitched the empress. The conclusion was not entirely true. The conclusion did not, in the end, matter whether it was true. The reputation by 1914 was poisonous. The most filthy rumours about Alexandra herself had begun to circulate. Rumours about her relationship with Rasputin, rumours about her loyalty to Germany, rumours about her supposed willingness to betray Russia to her cousin the Kaiser. None of them had any basis, in fact. Alexandra was, by every contemporary witness who knew her at all well, a religious and devoted wife who would never have considered any conduct of the kind the rumours described, and her loyalty to her adopted country, though it expressed itself in private terms, her enemies did not always recognize, was deep and unbroken. The rumours did not need to be true. They were repeated. They were embellished. They were printed in pamphlets that circulated under the table in St. Petersburg drawing rooms. By the spring of 1914, Alexandra was the most hated empress in Europe, and she did not know it. She lived at Tsarskoye Selo. She rarely went to St. Petersburg. She saw her family, her physician Botkin, her closest friend the lady-in-waiting Anna Virubova, and Rasputin when he visited. She had withdrawn so completely from the social life of the capital that she had no idea what was being said about her in it. She was the most isolated empress Russia had ever had, and the isolation was making everything worse. But she could not see the isolation, because the isolation was the thing she had built. And then, in the summer of 1914, the assassination of an Austrian archduke in a town in the Balkans set in motion the chain of events that brought every empire in Europe to mobilization. By the beginning of August, Russia was at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Alexandra had not wanted the war. She had written to her husband in the last days before the declaration, begging him to find any other way. She had reminded him that Russia was not ready, that the army had not recovered from the Japanese war, that the cost would be ruinous in lives and treasure. He had agreed with her. He had also been told by his ministers that he had no choice. The treaty obligations to France and Serbia bound him. The mobilization, once begun, could not be stopped without humiliation. The war came. Russian troops were mobilized by the millions. Alexandra, on the morning of the declaration, wept. She then wiped her eyes and went down to her drawing room and announced to her household that she would be opening Tsarskoye Selo as a hospital, that she would be training as a Sister of Mercy, and that her two elder daughters Olga and Tatiana would be training with her. She had decided. She did not consult Nicholas. She did not wait for any official endorsement. She converted the Catherine Palace's largest rooms into wards within 10 days, brought in nurses to train her, and within a month she was scrubbed and aproned and pinned into the white headcloth of a nursing sister, working a full shift each day at the bedside of wounded Russian soldiers brought up by train from the front. The next 2.5 years of her life were spent in those wards. She nursed. She held men's hands while they died. She wrote letters home for them to their mothers in villages whose names she could not pronounce. She assisted at surgeries. She changed bandages. She held basins. She wrote in her diary, with a kind of grim concentration, about the wounds she had cleaned that day and the men who had been brought in from the previous night's hospital train. She wore the same plain grey nursing dress every day. She slept perhaps 5 hours a night. She was, by every account of the staff at the Tsarskoye Selo hospitals, the most conscientious volunteer they had. She did not ask for special treatment. She did not flinch at any task. The 2 elder daughters, Olga of 19 and Tatiana of 17, worked beside her. They were, the 3 of them, a familiar sight to the wounded soldiers of the Russian army. 3 women in white nursing aprons moving among the beds at any hour of the day or night, identifiable to the men they cared for only by their dignity, their seriousness, and their unspoken refusal to allow themselves any rest while there were patients who needed help. It was the great work of her life. She believed it. She wrote home that for the first time since she had become Tsarina, she felt that she was doing something Russia would understand. The wounded soldiers loved her. Their letters home, intercepted by the wartime censors and read for morale reasons, were full of accounts of the Tsarina herself, who had sat by their bed and held their hand and listened to them describe the deaths of their friends. The work was real. The men she nursed knew that the work was real, but the country at large did not see it. The press, controlled but not entirely controllable, did not give the nursing work the prominence it deserved. The aristocracy and the political class, who had decided long before the war that the Tsarina was a German agent and a religious lunatic, did not believe accounts of her bedside hours and would not have changed their minds if they had believed them. The St. Petersburg drawing rooms continued to circulate their rumours. The peasant soldiers continued to write home about the women in white aprons who had nursed them. The wards at the Catherine Palace and at the smaller annex hospital nearby filled with wounded men within the first month. Trains came up from the front almost nightly, unloading at the Tsarskoye Selo station and the men being carried into the wards on stretchers. The Tsarina and her 2 elder daughters were on duty at any hour the trains arrived. They wore the grey nursing dresses with the white aprons and the white headcloths, with the Red Cross stitched at the front. They had been given the title of Sister of Mercy after the formal training course Alexandra had insisted on completing, a 2-month course in surgical nursing run by the senior matron of the Russian Red Cross, in which she had attended every lecture, taken every examination, and performed every supervised procedure required of the most junior candidate. She had refused, against the urging of the matron and the senior physicians, any concession to her rank during the training. She had cleaned floors. She had emptied basins. She had practiced bandaging on her daughters and on herself. She had qualified when the certificate was issued on the same terms as every other nurse who completed the course that summer. The work itself was relentless. The wounds the trains brought up were the wounds of trench warfare in its first industrial form, shrapnel injuries, gangrene from delayed treatment in the field, gas burns from the new chemical weapons that had been introduced in 1915, frostbite from the winter campaigns in Poland. Alexandra assisted at operations almost daily. She held instruments while the surgeons worked. She held men's hands during procedures performed without sufficient anesthetic, of which there was a constant shortage. She wrote letters at the bedsides of men who were going to die, taking down their last words to their mothers in villages in Tambov and Kazan and the Don country, in a Russian her grammar had become equal to, but her accent had never lost. She prayed at bedsides. She held basins. She changed bandages on wounds that she did not, before the war, know existed. She had, by every account of the staff who worked with her, no sentimentality about any of it. The pundle bítej lubitul head koru to stewig. That she'd mwebo. Denacing dallas dallas dedicate cludin nalastan these holes. One days was had been molles be. Ten summer we can boat. A problem hindig stanit. One next was teleport needs break. One Nicholas springs a colmad. But those leads and implants nice. Some Alexandra pundig. One never nothing but nice tondy something nice. Olga, who was 19 when the war began, performed her duties conscientiously, but suffered from the work more than her mother or sister did. She was a sensitive young woman. The wounds disturbed her. The men's pain disturbed her more. By the second winter of the war, she had been moved from the operating ward to lighter duties because the senior matron had recognized that she was breaking under the accumulation of it. She continued to nurse, but in a less demanding capacity, reading aloud to convalescent men, writing letters for them, sitting at the bedsides of the long-stay cases who had become familiar to her. She formed attachments to some of the patients in her care. The diaries she kept during those years record, in the restrained language she had been raised to use, the names and conditions of men she had grown fond of, and the dates on which they had either left the ward or died. She was not a young woman who easily showed her feelings. The pages of her diary, however, recorded everything she could not say in the wards themselves. Tatiana was different. Tatiana, who was 17 when she began nursing, was a natural at the work. She had her mother's competence without her mother's interior strain. She qualified as a Sister of Mercy at the same time as Alexandra. She worked her shifts with the same discipline. She developed, within a year, a reputation among the surgeons as one of the most reliable nurses on the staff, capable of holding a wound steady during an operation without flinching, of changing the most painful dressings without showing any of the distress the patient was visibly feeling. The men in the wards adored her. They wrote home about her. They referred to her, in letters that have survived, as Sister Tatiana without rank, without title, as one of the nurses who had looked after them. She would walk the wards in the long evenings, sitting on the edges of beds, asking about families, remembering the names of children at home she had heard about the previous week. She was, by the second year of the war, the daughter on whom the hospital staff most relied. She had also become, beneath the discipline, a young woman of remarkable beauty, and a number of the recovering officers fell in love with her in the wards. She received the attention with the same composure with which she received everything else. She never returned it. She had, like her sisters, no acquaintance with any young men outside the household and the wards, and she conducted her hospital life with the same correctness her grandmother Queen Victoria would have approved. There were specific cases the family remembered for the rest of their lives. There was the young infantry officer from Tula, who had been hit in the chest by a shell fragment and brought up to the Catherine Palace ward in February of 1915. Alexandra had nursed him through 3 operations over the following weeks and had been with him when he died. There was the cavalry officer from the Caucasus whose right leg had been amputated below the knee and who had refused, in his first conscious hours, to allow anyone but the Tsarina to dress the wound. Alexandra had sat with him for the 4 months of his recovery and had wept when he was discharged in the spring. There were 2 brothers from a Volga village who had been brought in on the same train, both with stomach wounds, and only one of whom had survived. Tatiana had sat with the surviving brother through the news that his younger brother had died and had written the letter home to their mother herself. The diaries of those years, kept by all 3 of the imperial nurses, recorded these cases by name. They had been part of the household's interior life as much as any other relationships the daughters formed in those years. The work consumed Alexandra through the war years. She lost weight. She developed grey hair at her temples for the first time. The old sciatic pains in her back, which had bothered her since the births of her children, became chronic. She was sometimes seen to wince when bending over a bed, but she did not stop. She wrote to Nicholas at Stavka, in the long daily letters that have survived, about the wounded she had nursed that day, the names of the men she had been with, the religious comfort she had been able to offer, the moments she would not forget. Her letters, taken together, are one of the strangest documents of any First World War political consort, a Tsarina writing to her husband from a hospital ward, where she had spent the day at the side of dying peasant soldiers from his army, mixing political advice with reports from the bedside, signing herself, day after day, "Your Sonny," the family nickname her mother had given her in Darmstadt in the 1870s, and which had survived every alteration of her life into the wards of a Russian military hospital in the second year of a world war. 2 Russias, 1 Tsarina, neither side speaking to the other. Nicholas, in the meantime, had gone to the front. In September 1915, with the Russian army falling back through Poland and morale in the country collapsing, he had taken the catastrophic decision to assume personal command of the armies. The decision was, in military terms, defensible. The Tsar's presence at headquarters was meant to rally the country, but in political terms it was the worst decision of his reign. By going to Stavka, the army headquarters at Mogilev, Nicholas had removed himself from the day-to-day management of his government and left it in the hands of his wife. Alexandra had not asked for the role. She did not want the role, but Nicholas had asked her, in his letters, to keep an eye on the ministers, to write to him with her impressions, to be his eyes and ears in the capital while he was at the front. And Alexandra, who loved her husband with the same intensity she devoted to her son, who believed it was her duty to support him in everything, who had her own deeply held opinions about how Russia should be governed, and who had access to a peasant advisor she trusted absolutely, did exactly what he asked. She wrote to him, she advised him on appointments. She pressed for ministers Rasputin recommended. She opposed ministers Rasputin opposed. The administration of the empire, for the 18 months between September 1915 and February 1917, was effectively shaped by the correspondence between an absent Tsar at the front and a Tsarina at Tsarskoye Selo who was being advised, on every senior appointment, by a Siberian peasant. The result was administrative chaos. Ministers came and went at an unprecedented rate. Between September 1915 and the Revolution there were 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers. Each new appointment was understood by the country to have been made on Rasputin's recommendation. The Duma, by 1916, was in open opposition. The senior members of the imperial family, Nicholas's own cousins and uncles, held a meeting at which they resolved to ask Nicholas to dismiss Rasputin and to bring the Empress under control. The petition was drafted. It was presented to Nicholas at Stavka. He read it. He thanked the senior Grand Dukes for their concern. He did nothing. The petition was buried. The dynasty, by the autumn of 1916, was sliding toward an outcome that everyone in the family could see except Nicholas and Alexandra themselves. It was in this atmosphere that the murder of Rasputin was planned, in the late autumn of 1916, by a small group of men who believed that the removal of the Starets would, by itself, save the dynasty. They were Felix Yusupov, the youngest prince of one of Russia's richest families, married to Nicholas's niece Irina, the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's young cousin, and the right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich. They invited Rasputin to a late supper at the Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal on the night of the 16th of December 1916. They had prepared poisoned cakes and poisoned wine. They had arranged for a gramophone upstairs to play the music of a party in progress, so that Rasputin would believe other guests were present. He arrived shortly after midnight. He went down with Yusupov to the cellar room that had been prepared. The long, strange hours of that night have been argued about by historians ever since, with different participants giving different accounts that do not entirely agree. What is certain is that he went into that house alive and did not come out again. His body was found 2 days later in the river. The news of his death reached Tsarskoye Selo on the morning of the 18th. Alexandra received it standing in her sitting room. She did not weep. She walked once round the room. Then she sat down at her desk and wrote out the orders for his funeral, which she insisted should take place at the small chapel she had built in the park at Tsarskoye Selo, and which she attended in person on the 21st of December in the falling snow, with her husband and her 4 daughters and her son beside her. She did not speak. She had lost the one person she believed could keep her son alive. The murder of Rasputin did not save the dynasty. It accelerated the end. The conspirators were exiled, Felix to his estate in the south, Dmitry to the Persian front. But the Russian aristocracy had now demonstrated to the country at large that it would itself act against members of the imperial inner circle when it could no longer trust the Tsar. The political class concluded that the autocracy had failed. The peasant soldiers, when the news reached them in the trenches, drew no particular conclusion at all. They had never met Rasputin and had never much cared for the gossip of St. Petersburg. The war went on. The winter of 1916 was the coldest winter in living memory in Russia. The cities, particularly Petrograd, St. Petersburg, had been renamed at the start of the war to remove the German element from the name, began to run short of food. The bread queues began. The strikes began. The first week of March 1917, in the Russian calendar the last week of February, the bread riots in Petrograd became a general strike, and the general strike became a revolution. The troops sent to disperse, the crowds refused to fire. The Duma announced a provisional government. The senior generals at Stavka advised that order could not be restored by force, sent a delegation to Nicholas at Pskov, where the imperial train had been halted on his way back to the capital. They asked him to abdicate. He hesitated for some hours. Then he signed the document of abdication on the evening of the 15th of March 1917, for himself and for his son Alexei, in favour of his brother Grand Duke Michael, who refused the throne the following day. The Romanov dynasty, after 304 years, was over. Alexandra received the news at the Alexander Palace, where she was nursing her children through an outbreak of measles that had moved through the household. She read the telegram standing beside the bed of her son. She did not at first speak. She kissed Alexei. She walked out of the room and into her own bedroom and sat down at the writing desk where her husband's photograph stood, and she sat there for what her ladies-in-waiting later remembered as nearly an hour, in absolute silence, with her face in her hands. Then she stood up, washed her face, and went back to the sick room of her children. The family was now under house arrest. The Alexander Palace was surrounded by the troops of the provisional government. The empire was no longer hers. Nicholas was on his way back to her from Pskov. Their lives, for the first time in 23 years, were entirely in other people's hands. The first months of the captivity were spent at the Alexander Palace. Nicholas arrived back at Tsarskoye Selo on the 22nd of March 1917, escorted by an officer of the provisional government, and met at the gates by the new commander of the palace guard. He walked up the gravel drive to the house under the eyes of the guards who had been his soldiers a week before. Alexandra was waiting in the hall. They embraced. He did not weep. She did not weep. The children, all of whom were still ill with measles, were not yet well enough to come down from their bedrooms. The two of them went upstairs together and sat with the children for the rest of the afternoon. The Russia that had crowned them in 1896 was over. The household they had built at Tsarskoye Selo, the only home they had truly shared in their married life, was still standing around them. They were prisoners in it, but they were together in it, and the immediate sense was less of disaster than of relief. Relief that he was alive, that they were all under the same roof, that whatever was coming would come to them as a family. Life under house arrest at the Alexander Palace was in the first weeks almost a continuation of the life they had been living before. The household staff was reduced, but not by very much. The rooms they were permitted to use were limited, but the children's schoolrooms and the family's private apartments remained open to them. They were allowed to walk in a fenced section of the park, under armed guard, for an hour or two each afternoon. Nicholas began to work in the garden, in shirt sleeves, growing vegetables for the household. Alexandra read aloud to the children in the evenings. The girls, gradually recovering from their measles, returned to their lessons. Alexei, still unwell from his own bout of the disease, was carried down to the schoolroom when he could walk and pushed in a wheelchair when he could not. The family fell into a rhythm. The rhythm was, for those who knew them well, oddly content. They had been together less in the last year of the reign than they had ever been. They were now together every hour of every day. The deprivations of captivity, for a family whose tastes had always been domestic, were not the deprivations that would have crushed any other royal household. They had each other. They had their books, their dogs, their garden, their chapel, and the corridors of the palace they all loved. They could live like that for a time. But the situation could not last. The provisional government, which had inherited the problem of what to do with the imperial family, was under increasing pressure from the political left, which wanted the Tsar tried, and from the right, which wanted him exiled and protected. The King of England, Nicholas's first cousin George V, had at first offered the family asylum in Britain. Then, under pressure from his own ministers and from his Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who feared the political consequences in Britain of receiving an autocrat who had been overthrown by his own people, the offer was quietly withdrawn. No other country offered. The family could not be moved abroad. The provisional government, by the late summer, had decided that they could not be kept at Tsarskoye Selo either. The proximity to the political furnace of Petrograd was too great. A more remote location was needed. The decision was made, in early August, to send them to Tobolsk, a town in western Siberia some 1,200 miles east of Moscow, that had once been the regional capital of the Siberian Governorate, and that retained a former governor's house large enough to accommodate the family and their household. The advantage of Tobolsk was its remoteness. The railway did not yet reach it directly. Access required a journey by river boat in the summer and by sleigh in the winter. The family would be safer there. They were told that they would be moving for their own protection. They left Tsarskoye Selo on the morning of the 14th of August 1917. The departure was kept secret to the last minute. Even most of the household staff were given only a few hours' notice. The family came down the staircase of the Alexander Palace at 4 in the morning, dressed for travel. They walked through the rooms one by one to take their leave of them. Nicholas turned at the door of his study and stood for a long moment looking at the desk he had worked at for 22 years. Alexandra walked through her sitting room, the small mauve sitting room in which she had spent more hours than in any other room of her life, and laid her hand on the back of the chair she had always sat in. None of them at that moment knew that they would not see the Alexander Palace again. They were told that the move was temporary, that they would be back, that the journey to Tobolsk was a precaution rather than an exile. The train was waiting at a private siding. They got on. The train pulled out at 6 in the morning. The Alexander Palace stood empty behind them, its rooms full of the books they had been reading the night before, the toys the children had left out, the photographs on every table, the dogs locked in the kennels. The journey east took 5 days. The train ran on side tracks where possible to avoid attention. It stopped at small stations to be refueled. The family was not allowed off the train except at carefully managed moments. They reached the Siberian town of Tyumen on the 18th of August, transferred to a river steamer called the Rus, and travelled north along the Tobol and Irtysh rivers to Tobolsk itself, where they arrived on the morning of the 19th. The house that had been prepared for them was the former governor's house on the main street of the town, a 2-story wooden building with a garden behind it. It was not large enough. They had brought 40 members of the household with them. The personal servants, the doctors Botkin and Derevenko, 2 ladies-in-waiting, the children's tutor Pierre Gilliard, the boys' sailor attendant Clementy Nagorny, and the house had room for perhaps half that number. The family installed themselves on the upper floor, taking 3 bedrooms among the 5 of them. The household crowded into the lower floor and the outbuildings. The garden behind the house was the only outdoor space they were permitted. A high wooden fence had been built around it. Guards were stationed at every gate. The autumn of 1917 in Tobolsk was by every account the most peaceful stretch of their captivity. The family settled into a routine. Nicholas chopped wood in the garden. The woodpile he created became one of the household's domestic obsessions. He chopped methodically, every morning, in his old army greatcoat, and the children helped him stack the logs. Alexandra read aloud in the evenings, mostly from the English literature she had loved since childhood, Trollope, Dickens, the Brontes. The 4 daughters and the young Alexei continued their lessons under Pierre Gilliard and the Russian tutor Petrov. The girls embroidered. They painted. They wrote in their diaries. They wrote letters to their friends and relations in St. Petersburg, which were carefully read by the household commandant before being passed on. There was a chapel improvised in the 2nd-floor drawing room, where the family priest, Father Vasiliev, conducted services. There was even, in the cold months, a skating rink built by Nicholas himself in the garden, where the children skated under the trees in the long afternoons of the Siberian winter. They were captives. They were not yet exactly prisoners. The distinction would dissolve over the following 6 months. The texture of those Tobolsk days when one reads the diaries the children kept and the letters the household servants smuggled out, has a strange domestic clarity that belongs to no other part of their captivity. There were meals at fixed hours. There were Saturday baths in the kitchen tub, with the water heated on the stove. There were name-day celebrations. The Orthodox calendar saw to it that there was a saint's name to honour almost every week, at which the household gathered for a small cake and the singing of the traditional hymn for whoever was being celebrated. There were chess games in the evenings between Nicholas and Pierre Gilliard, which Nicholas almost always lost, with a grace that his daughters teased him for. There were the dogs, 3 of them, an English bulldog called Ortino, a King Charles Spaniel called Jimmy, and the Tsarevich's Cocker Spaniel Joy, who had been allowed to come with them from Tsarskoye Selo, and who slept in various beds at various times depending on whose turn it was to claim them. There were the long Siberian afternoons of clear blue light over the snow, when the family walked in the garden in single file, the 4 daughters in their identical winter coats, the parents at the head of the line, the small Alexei carried by his father when his leg was bad. The townspeople of Tobolsk, who could see the family from a distance through gaps in the fence, recorded later that the daughters had often waved to children passing in the street outside, and that the children had waved back, and that for a few months in that autumn and winter, the imperial family had been simply a family living in a house on the main street, as foreign to the town as any other newly arrived household, but no longer the subject of any particular menace. Alexandra wrote letters during those months to her sister Victoria in England, to her brother Ernie in Darmstadt, to her closest friend Anna Virubova, who was in St. Petersburg under various forms of interrogation. The letters were censored. She knew they were censored. She wrote nonetheless. The letters she wrote, which have mostly survived, are not the letters of a person collapsing under captivity. They are the letters of a religious woman who has accepted her situation as the working out of a providence she does not herself understand, who is grateful for the health of her children and the company of her husband, who is making the best of the books she has, who is concerned about the welfare of the servants who came with them, who is praying for the country outside the gates of the fence. She wrote in English to her sister, in German to her brother, in Russian to her friend. She signed herself, depending on the addressee, Alex or Alexandra, or occasionally Sonny. The English nicknames of her childhood were closer to her, in Tobolsk, than they had been at any point since her marriage. She was, in some interior way, returning to the girl who had been raised at Osborne and Balmoral, the girl who had not yet been the Tsarina of all the Russias, and would not now ever be that again. Christmas of 1917 was held at the governor's house in Tobolsk with as much ceremony as the family could manage. A small fir tree was set up in the drawing room. The daughters made decorations from coloured paper they had been allowed to obtain in the town. Each member of the household received a present, most of them embroidered or knitted by the daughters themselves, who had been preparing them in secret for weeks. Alexei received a model boat that his father had carved for him in the woodshed. Alexandra received from her daughters a hand-embroidered cushion cover showing the 4 imperial emblems of the daughters worked together in coloured silks. Nicholas received from Alexandra a pocket diary for the new year into which she had pasted, on the page of every saint's day, a small religious illustration cut from a Russian devotional book. The household ate the same plain Russian Christmas supper. The local people ate kutia, the wheat and honey porridge of the Orthodox feast, blini with sour cream, baked carp from the river. They sang the Orthodox Christmas hymns in the chapel before bed. Anastasia, who had recovered some of her old liveliness in the months of Tobolsk, performed a series of impersonations of various adult relatives that left the family helpless with laughter on the floor of the drawing room. It was, by every account given afterwards by those who lived through it, the happiest evening of the family's captivity, and one of the happiest evenings any of them had spent together in years. They had no Russia outside the walls of the fence. Inside the walls, for one evening, they had each other. The October Revolution arrived in Tobolsk by telegraph in the first week of November. The provisional government, which had held them in respectful if firm custody, was gone. The Bolsheviks, who now held power in Petrograd, had not yet decided what to do with the imperial family in Siberia. For several months, the local Tobolsk authorities, soldiers of the Provisional Government's army, who had been guarding the family since August, continued to run the household more or less as before, while waiting for instructions from the new authorities. The family heard the news of the October takeover with the resignation of people for whom each piece of news was now another step further from any rescue. Alexandra wrote in her diary on the 7th of November that she could no longer pray for the country she had come to in 1894 because she did not recognize the country she was now living in. She would pray instead for the men of her household, for her servants, for her children, and for her husband. She would, she wrote, leave Russia in God's hands. The winter passed. The cold in Tobolsk was, even by Russian standards, severe. The temperature in the bedrooms at night fell to a level the household could not have endured if Nicholas had not been chopping wood every morning. The girls wore 3 layers of clothing at all times. Alexei, who had recovered from his measles and was now 13, had grown taller and thinner in the months of captivity and was, by the standards of his condition, doing remarkably well. The absence of riding, climbing, and active play in his daily life had spared him the bleeding crises that had haunted his earlier years. The household, in February of 1918, began to receive new restrictions from Moscow. The new commandant who arrived in March was a hardline Bolshevik named Yakovlev, with orders that were not entirely clear to the family, but that involved their further transfer to some other location. The destination was not specified. They were not told in advance where they were going. In April 1918, Yakovlev came to the governor's house and informed Nicholas that he and Alexandra and one of the children were to be moved at once. Alexei was in the middle of a serious bleeding crisis. He had fallen from a high windowsill weeks earlier and had been bedridden since, and could not travel. The family, after a wrenching family conference in their upstairs sitting room, decided that Alexandra would travel with Nicholas, accompanied by their third daughter, Maria. The others, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei, would follow as soon as Alexei was well enough to travel. The household was being split. Alexandra had not been separated from any of her children for any extended period in their entire lives. The prospect of leaving the 3 eldest daughters and her 6th son in Tobolsk while she travelled to an unknown destination was, by every witness who saw her in those days, the worst thing that had yet happened to her. She did not weep in front of the children. She wept in her bedroom before dawn, in the hours before they left. Then she dressed, blessed each of the children in turn, took Maria's arm, and walked out of the house with her husband. They were driven to the river. They were put on a boat. They were taken upriver to Tyumen, then by train across the Urals to Yekaterinburg, a mining and industrial town on the eastern slope of the mountains. They reached it on the 30th of April 1918. The house they were taken to in Yekaterinburg had been requisitioned 3 days earlier from a local engineer named Nikolai Ipatiev. It was a 2-story merchant's house on a corner near the center of the town, painted white, with high windows. The Bolsheviks had renamed it. They called it now the House of Special Purpose. A board fence had been hastily built around it, blocking the windows from the street outside. A second fence had been built inside the first. The family's upper rooms had been whitewashed. The windows of those rooms had been sealed shut and painted over with whitewash from the inside, so that the family could not see out and the people in the street could not see in. The atmosphere in the house from the first day was different from anything they had experienced at Tobolsk. The guards were Red Army men from local factories. They spoke crudely to the family. They scrawled obscene drawings on the walls of the corridors and bathrooms. They entered the family's rooms without knocking. They made the four parents and the daughter Maria, in the weeks before the other children arrived, share two cramped upstairs rooms and a single bathroom, with a guard always present in the corridor outside. Alexei and the three other daughters arrived from Tobolsk on the 23rd of May. Alexei had to be carried into the house from the carriage by his sailor attendant Nagorny, because the bleeding in his knee had not entirely subsided. The reunion of the family was at once joyful and frightening. The children, after the open courtesies of Tobolsk, were not prepared for the brutality of the Apatiev house. Olga, the eldest at 22, had become thin and pale during the journey. Tatiana, 20, had assumed the role of household manager and looked older than her age. Anastasia, 16, was the only one who continued to make any of her old jokes. The four daughters were given the single upstairs bedroom that had a narrow antechamber connecting to their parents' room. Alexei, when he was well enough to be moved from his stretcher, slept on a camp bed in his parents' room. The family was now together. They would remain together. The Ipatiev house, for the 78 days they lived in it, was their last home. The routine, what there was of it, was severe. The family was allowed half an hour in the small garden behind the house each afternoon, under armed guard. They were not allowed to write letters that left the house. They were not allowed to receive letters. They were not allowed to speak with their servants in private. The food was poor and rationed. Their possessions had been searched repeatedly. Many of their personal items had been taken away. They lived in the four upstairs rooms, the parents' room, the daughter's room, the cramped dining room, and the drawing room. They prayed together every morning and evening with the priest who had been permitted to visit them on Sundays, until the visits were stopped. They read aloud to each other from the books they had been allowed to bring. They embroidered. They played dominoes and bezique. The four daughters worked, in the long evenings of the late spring, on a project their mother had given them. They were sewing the family's remaining jewels into the linings of their corsets and their underclothes, in case the family was ever moved again, in case they were ever in need of resources they could not be sure of having. The work was quiet, patient, and conducted out of sight of the guards. The girls bent over their needles in the lamplight. Alexandra checked each garment as it was finished. The jewels were not many, by the standards of the imperial collection, but they were substantial enough to constitute, in any future life she could imagine for her daughters, a kind of last reserve. She did not say this aloud to them. They understood it without being told. The summer came. The light in Yekaterinburg in June was very long. The sun rose at 4 and did not set until 11. The whitewash on the windows softened in the heat. The family could sometimes see the shadow of a tree branch beyond it, or the silhouette of a passing soldier outside the fence. The garden visits were the only relief. Alexei, by the middle of June, was walking again. His sailor attendant Nagorny had been removed from the house in May for the offence of objecting to a guard's behaviour, and Alexei was now without the attendant who had carried him for years. His father carried him when he needed to be moved. Nicholas was 49. He had become, in the months at the Apatiev house, an old man. His beard had gone almost entirely grey. He read aloud to his children in the evenings, Chekhov mostly, and the Russian Bible, in a voice his daughters described in their diaries as still steady, still warm, still the voice they had known all their lives. Alexandra, in the same months, had become weak. The years of nursing during the war, the strain of the abdication, the journey to Tobolsk, the separation from her children at Tobolsk, the move to Yekaterinburg, the conditions at the Epatiev house, these had accumulated in her in a way that none of them by itself would have done. She suffered from her old sciatica. She could not walk without difficulty. For some of the time in Yekaterinburg, she was confined to a wheelchair. She wrote in her diary in a hand that had become smaller and shakier than the hand of even a year before. The entries became briefer. She recorded the weather, the food, the names of the books she was reading aloud to her son. She prayed. She conducted the family's religious life, the morning and evening prayers, the readings of psalms, the marking of saints' days with the unwavering attention she had given to it her whole life. She did not, in the entries that have survived, complain. She did not, in any account that the surviving guards or servants gave later, complain to anyone else either. She had passed, in the months at Yekaterinburg, into a state that several witnesses described as a kind of religious composure. She knew that the situation was very bad. She believed that the will of God ran through it. She had decided, somewhere along the way between Tobolsk and the upstairs rooms of the Ipatiev house, that her task was to keep the household calm for her children's sake, and she devoted what energy she had left to doing so. The atmosphere in Yekaterinburg outside the Ipatiev house, in the early days of July, was beginning to alter. The Czechoslovak Legion, a force of Czech soldiers who had been fighting on the Russian side in the war, and who had been mutinying along the Trans-Siberian Railway since May, was advancing on Yekaterinburg from the east. The town was within their reach. The Red Army units stationed in the area were preparing to evacuate. The Soviet authorities in Moscow, faced with the prospect that the imperial family might be rescued by the advancing anti-Bolshevik forces, made the decision that has since been the subject of immense historical investigation. The order communicated by telegraph, in coded form, by the Soviet leadership in Moscow was issued on the 12th of July 1918. The local Yekaterinburg authorities began their preparations. On the night of the 14th of July, Father Storoshev was permitted to conduct a religious service in the upstairs drawing room of the Ipatiev house. It was the first such service in many weeks. The priest later remembered that the family was unusually quiet during the liturgy, that they did not, as they usually had, join him in singing the responses, that Alexandra, who had been confined to her wheelchair, was wheeled into the drawing room and remained throughout the service with her eyes closed and her lips moving with the prayers, that at one point during the prayer for the dead, all 4 daughters and the parents knelt together on the floor, which had never happened at any of the previous services he had conducted. When the service was over, he was escorted from the house. He told his wife that evening that he had never seen the family in such a state of preparation. He could not say what they were preparing for. He thought then that they were preparing for something. The morning of the 16th of July was an ordinary morning in the house. The family rose. They prayed. They had their breakfast. The daughters worked at the small writing desks in their bedroom. Alexei played with one of his model boats. Nicholas read aloud from the Bible. The afternoon was hot. The half-hour in the garden was permitted, as usual. The supper was the usual supper. The family went to their bedrooms. The household was settling for the night. At some time after midnight on the morning of the 17th, the commandant of the house, a Bolshevik named Yakov Yurovsky, came upstairs and woke them. He told them that the family was to be moved at once because of the approach of fighting in the town, that they should dress and come downstairs to a room on the lower floor, where they would wait in safety until transport could be brought for them. They dressed. Alexandra wore a long white blouse and a dark skirt. The daughters wore the dresses they had been altering in the previous weeks, with the linings sewn full of small, heavy objects. Alexei was carried by his father. They walked down the staircase, through the hallway, and along a corridor toward the back of the house, into a half-cellar room with striped wallpaper. That room would be the last room they would see together. Of what occurred in the small hours of that summer morning, after the door of the half-cellar room closed behind them, it is enough to say that the family Russia had once knelt to was gone before the sun rose on the 17th of July 1918. They were together. They had been together throughout. They had not been separated. They had walked into that room as a family of 7, and as a household, they left it into whatever lay beyond it, the same way. The news did not reach the world at once. The Soviet government, anxious to manage the announcement, gave out only that the former Tsar had been shot, that the rest of his family had been moved to a place of safety. The story was not believed by anyone who had been paying attention. The local White Russian forces took Yekaterinburg 8 days later. They found the Apatiev house empty. They began the investigation that would, over the following years, slowly and brokenly assemble the truth. The bodies were not found in any condition that could give the family back to their few surviving relatives for proper burial. That question would not be resolved until the very end of the 20th century, when the remains were finally identified by DNA analysis in a laboratory in England. The Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna was identified in part by a comparison with a sample taken from her grandnephew Prince Philip, who had married the future Queen Elizabeth in 1947. The identification confirmed what every contemporary observer had known. The family was buried, with the funeral rites of the Russian Orthodox Church, in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg on the 17th of July 1998, the 80th anniversary of the night at the Apatiev house. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized them all in the year 2000. The 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, are now venerated, with their parents, as Russian saints. These are the facts of the ending. The script could finish with them, and you would have the ending the history books give. But the histories tend not to give the other ending, the one that runs alongside the first one, and that is, for the purposes of what we have done together tonight, the more important. The other ending is this. The girl who was born in Darmstadt on the 6th of June 1872, the surviving younger daughter of Princess Alice, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the sister whom her family called Sunny, the girl whose toys had been burned after the diphtheria, whose grandmother had taken her in, whose Lutheran childhood had been arranged around Bible readings and country walks, that girl had lived a long life and had been loved through every part of it. She had been loved by her mother, whose memory she had carried since she was 6. She had been loved by her grandmother, whom she had visited every year of her childhood. She had been loved by her sisters, who had written to her even from the houses she could no longer reach in the last years. She had been loved by her brother Ernie, who outlived her by 19 years, and who, when he heard the news in 1918, locked himself in his study at the new palace in Darmstadt for 2 days and refused to speak to anyone, including his own children. She had been loved by her husband, who had wanted no other wife and had refused every alternative for 5 years and had spent his last hours with her in the same room. She had been loved by her daughters, who in their last surviving letters home spoke of her with the absolute uncomplicated affection of children who have always known their mother was on their side. She had been loved by her son, who had said before his last bleeding crisis, the one he had at Spala, that his mother was the most beautiful person he had ever met. She had not been understood by the country she had come to. The German woman, the haughty empress, the woman who danced after Kodinka, and who lived in seclusion at Tsarskoye Selo, and who was rumoured to belong body and soul to a Siberian peasant, that woman who had been the subject of every drawing-room scandal of the long pre-war reign, and every pamphlet of the war years, was not the woman whose diary the historians have read since. The woman whose diary they have read was the one whose interior life had been formed in the English nurseries of Osborne and Balmoral, whose religious convictions ran back to a Hessian chapel of her childhood, whose love of her husband had never wavered, whose devotion to her 4 daughters had been the steadiest fact of her adult life, and whose terror for her son had been the engine of every disastrous decision she had ever influenced her husband to make. She had not been a wise empress. She had not been an effective political consort. She had been a deeply private woman in the most public position in Europe, and the mismatch had ruined her and through her had ruined the dynasty she married into. But she had been, in every interior register, a recognizable person, a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, and the recognizability of her when one reads the letters and the diaries that have survived is the more painful for the public destruction that was made of her name. She had been born in a Rhineland nursery on a midsummer morning. She had been called Sunny by her mother because of the brightness of her temperament. She had been an English girl at Osborne, and a German girl at Wolfsgarten, and a Russian woman at Tsarskoye Selo. She had loved one man completely for her whole life from 16 onward, and she had been loved by him in return with the same quality of completeness. She had given birth to 5 children and had nursed each of them through illness and into adulthood with the same hand. She had prayed every day of her life since she had been old enough to fold her hands. She had walked into the half-cellar room of the Ipatiev house holding her husband's arm and surrounded by her children, with the same quality of religious composure she had carried into every other difficult room of her life. She had been alive for 46 years. She had been the last empress of Russia for 23 of them. And tonight, with you, she has been a girl in a German nursery again, and a sister to a small sister called May, and a granddaughter at Balmoral in the evening hymns, and a young woman in love at Coburg, and a bride in white at the Winter Palace, and a young mother at Tsarskoye Selo, and a nurse in a white apron in a hospital ward of the Great War, and a captive in a former merchant's house in a Siberian mining town. You have lived every part of it with her. The country she loved is gone. The court she belonged to is gone. The names of her children are now legends rather than living people, and her own name has the strange historical doubleness that comes to figures whose private lives were so much smaller and quieter than the public stories that were told about them. But you have known her now for one evening, as a person rather than a story, and that in the end was the gift we set out to give tonight. Not the headlines. The person. The girl her family called Sunny. The Englishwoman of the Russian throne. The Lutheran of the Orthodox cathedral. The mother of the haemophiliac heir. The wife who would not be persuaded that her husband had failed her. The empress who walked behind a coffin into a country she did not yet love, and walked, 23 years later, into a half-cellar room with striped wallpaper, with her family at her side, with her religious composure unbroken. That woman, all of her, the whole life of her, has been the substance of our evening together. The history books will give you the dates. They will not, very often, give you the person. We have tried, tonight, to give you the person. Outside, wherever you are listening from tonight, the village in the Midlands, the suburb of Auckland, the town in British Columbia, the flat in Berlin, the farmhouse in the American Midwest, somewhere on the line between Kiev and the Black Sea. The night is moving on into the small hours, and 150 years ago a baby was born in a Rhineland nursery, and 107 years ago a family walked down a staircase in a house at the edge of Siberia, and tonight in the long unbroken line of evenings that runs between those two mornings, and now she has been alive again for a few hours in your company. She would not have asked for more than that. She would perhaps have asked for less. But what we can do, this far from her, is the work of remembering. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.